I call this meeting to order. This is meeting number 51 of the Standing Committee on Finance. I encourage colleagues and our guests to take our seats, please. Orders of the day pursuant to Standing Order 83.1, continuing our conversations on pre-budget consultations 2014. We have before us here in the first panel this afternoon 5 witnesses. We have, first of all, the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. We have again back Ms. Armin Yelnizyan.
Wow.
Yeah, I think I get it on the 3rd time
if
back.
If I come here often enough, you're going to get it like, like
you have
this.
to keep coming back. Yeah. You have, welcome back, the Canadians for Tax Fairness, Executive Director, Mr. Dennis Howlett.
Thank you.
From Restaurants Canada, we have Ms. Joyce Reynolds, the Executive Vice President, Government Affairs. From Portfolio Management Association of Canada, we have the Chair, Industry Regulation and Tax Committee, Mr. Scott Mahaffey. And from Tax Executives Institute Incorporated, the Vice President, Canadian Affairs, Mr. Paul, is it McGrath or McGrath? McGrath?
Correct.
McGrath, welcome to the committee. You will each have 5 minutes for your opening statement, and then we will have questions from members. We will begin with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives.
It is my great pleasure to be here, and it is an honor to be here with all of you. Thank you so much for keeping on. I'm so proud of Parliament right now. I thank you for the invitation to discuss how we could improve Canada's taxation and regulatory regimes, and I would like to present for your consideration 3 proposals to improve the short game, the long game, and the strong game for Canada's public revenues and the rules that govern them. With respect to the short game, economic growth is slowing around the world, and in Canada, both the IMF and the Bank of Canada have downgraded growth expectations very recently, and we expect the fiscal outlook will reflect that. Since July, when these growth rates have been downgraded, oil prices have plunged by 25%, and they continue to fall this week on the markets. The exchange rate of the Canadian dollar has fallen by about 6%, which means we are getting less for the oil we are exporting, and all of our imports are increasing in price. You add in a U.S. economy that is growing in its energy independence, the fear of a triple-dip recession in Europe, and deflation, looming credit crisis in China. There is absolutely no shortage of reasons to worry about how difficult it's becoming to attain and maintain budget balance in the coming months. And while there is a risk adjustment factor of $3 billion built into your budget, into the federal budget of 2014, plunging oil and gas prices could wipe up to $4 billion from federal revenues alone. In addition, your pledges to military action to fight ISIS abroad and enhanced security measures to fight terrorism here at home will cost us more. Despite those growing fiscal pressures, we know that the Government of Canada is committed to more tax cuts. The EI reductions and the doubling of the child fitness tax credit and making it refundable will take about $255 million out of the public purse next year. 2 remaining large commitments from the spring 2011 election campaign will take billions more. Of course, there's been much debate over the income splitting proposal, which in its original form would cost $3 billion. Less attention has been paid to the proposals to double contributions to the tax-free savings account, which one study in the Canadian Tax Journal estimated would result in a loss of 6% of federal revenues on maturity. Each of these tax cuts simply reward existing behavior rather than incentivizing new behavior. Tax credits for children's fitness, even when refundable, recover a small fraction of the costs, leaving enrollment for most physical activity programs unchanged for the majority of young families. Employment insurance premium reductions flow to small businesses whether they create or eliminate jobs. The tax-free savings account and income splitting proposals encourage saving rather than spending, not working rather than working. Since tax measures that reduce rather than enhance economic growth work in a direction opposite and contrary to your short-term policy objectives, my first recommendation is that the Government of Canada not proceed with tax cuts at this time. The long game means we need to broaden the tax base. Population aging will cause labour shortages, reduce revenues, and increase expenditures over the next 20 years. At the very same time, it is expected that at least $1 trillion of wealth will be transferred between generations of Canadians. The dependency ratio, which is the ratio of those who are too young or too old to work, will rise over the next 20 years. But even so, it will not match the dependency ratio of 1961, the biggest difference being that there will be more older dependents than younger dependents than in 61. In 1961, the federal government accounted for 16% of the economy. This was an era that preceded programs like Medicare, Canada Assistance Plan, and post-secondary education expansions.
1 minute.
1 minute left? This is not the time to cut the federal role, which is what is anticipated, but broaden it. There is room to raise rates, but another approach is to broaden the tax base by extending the GST to financial activities and services, capping lifetime contributions to tax shelters such as the tax-free savings account, introducing an inheritance tax, eliminating deductions for stock options and capital gains, and tightening tax expenditures, and tackling tax evasion more vigorously. And this is my last recommendation. The strong game means that you get tougher on tax crime, not more lax. In 2007-8, Departmental Performance Review of the CRA noted that the reporting compliance sector conducted 27,000 audits of international and large corporations and recovered $5.7 billion. It also audited 321,000 small and medium businesses and recovered $2 billion. Clearly, CRA can be a profit centre for the Government of Canada if the staffing is maintained, and yet the reporting compliance department will see a 25% reduction in staff, more staff taken away from criminal investigations and auditing international and large businesses, and more people put on small and medium. And at the same time, just weeks ago, the CRA has announced it would be reducing red tape. This is the wrong direction to go in for a government that prides itself on being tough on crime. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentation. We'll now hear from the Canadians for Tax Fairness, please.
Thank you for the opportunity to provide input on the next federal budget. Our message is that the federal government needs to increase its revenue in order to have the resources required to reduce income inequality and poverty, boost investments in social and physical infrastructure, and tackle climate change. The government can do this by, number one, not introducing any more unfair and ineffective tax cuts. The Finance Minister is expected to declare that there will be a surplus and announce more tax cuts in the next budget. But before considering any further tax cuts, the government should evaluate what previous tax cuts, totaling an annual $43 billion since 2006, have accomplished in terms of their stated objectives. Let's examine a few examples. The corporate income tax cuts did not boost investment or stimulate job creation. Jim Stanford convincingly demonstrates in the chapter of a book we published called The Great Revenue Robbery that business investment spending in Canada declined since the federal government began reducing corporate income taxes. And according to Statistics Canada, there is now $630 billion in dead money in cash reserves, which is not being invested to create jobs. Far more jobs would have been created if the government kept this money and invested it in infrastructure and public services. This is backed up by a 2011 study by the Finance Department that shows the infrastructure spending had a 1.6 multiplier effect, while tax cuts had little or no multiplier effects. Many of the boutique tax cuts have also not generated the intended results. The Children's Fitness Tax Credit, for example, went disproportionately to upper-income families, and according to a University of Alberta study, it did little to encourage participation in youth sport. Given the clear evidence that tax cuts have been unfair and ineffective, it's sheer madness to consider income splitting for families in the next federal budget. An analysis by Queen's University tax law professor Kathleen Leahy that was done for Canadians for Tax Fairness shows that almost 30% of the benefit of income splitting would go to the top 10% of families with incomes over $170,000. If supporting families is the goal, then a far better way to do this would be to fund quality nonprofit childcare. Second, we need to close unfair and ineffective tax loopholes. Many of the tax loopholes, tax breaks disproportionately benefit the wealthiest and increase income inequality. They also make the tax system more complex, making it difficult for an ordinary taxpayer to know all the deductions and tax benefits they might be entitled to claim without the assistance of a professional tax expert. The most unfair tax loophole, in our view, is the stock option deduction that allows high-paid company executives and directors to pay half the rate of tax on their compensation that is given in the form of stock options. This policy exacerbates the problem of growing income inequality when the government should be doing more to close it. According to the Tax Expenditures and Evaluations report of the Finance Department, the stock options deduction costs the federal government $785 million a year. And if losses to provincial governments are added in, the total revenue tops $1 billion. How can we justify subsidizing the incomes of the wealthiest Canadians and then claim we don't have the resources to end child poverty or ensure clean drinking water for Aboriginal communities?
1 minute.
Third, more, not less, needs to be done to tackle tax havens. There were some encouraging steps made by the federal government. The last two federal budgets had measures designed to do something about tax havens, but I'm very worried that recent actions, including Globe and Mail report that Finance Minister Oliver has quietly stopped efforts to investigate corporate use of tax shopping, tax treaty shopping, and the recent cuts to the Canada Revenue Agency, would seem that the government is going back on its commitment to tackle tax havens. The problem is actually growing, not lessening, and much more needs to be done. And finally, more revenue is required to reduce income inequality and poverty, boost investment in social and physical infrastructure, and tackle tax havens.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for your presentation. We'll now go to Restaurants Canada, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm also delighted to be back in Ottawa again. I'm here representing the $68 billion, 1.1 million employee restaurant industry. We've got lots of ideas on how Canada's taxation and regulatory regimes could be improved, but given the 5-minute limit, I'm going to focus on two. One in the area of regulation. There's a pressing need for regulation in the area of credit card acceptance fees. We're happy to hear that that could be addressed as early as this week. And one tax that has a disproportionate impact on the labor-intensive restaurant industry, and that's payroll taxes. There is rarely an issue that unites the entire restaurant industry, but skyrocketing credit card acceptance fees is one. Regardless if we're talking about a table service or a quick service business, independent operator or chain, large or small, even an institutional food service provider, all are handcuffed by a credit card system that they have to use and which has costs that they cannot predict or control. 93% of our members identify credit card fees as a serious concern, with 79% saying they have a big impact on their bottom line. Restaurants Canada has been raising the alarm bells about the proliferation of premium credit cards and their impact on merchant fees since 2008. These premium cards, which provide insurance, travel programs, cashback, and other perks to cardholders, have fees that are up to 25 times higher than standard ones. Interchange fees charged to Canadian merchants are higher than almost anywhere else in the world. Our payment system has evolved from a cash and check-based system to one where the Canadian dollar is primarily transacted electronically with control by private enterprises. Associations representing merchants have come together in an unprecedented way to pressure credit card companies and their issuing banks to rein in their fees. And quite frankly, government has been pressuring them for a long time as well. But the credit card companies and issuing banks continue to sweeten the reward pot for cardholders and raise prices at will in one-sided negotiations with merchants. Last year, the Competition Tribunal ruling in response to concerns raised by the Competition Bureau to unfair business practices by Visa and MasterCard identified a regulatory framework as a solution. And the longer it takes government to intervene, the richer the rewards to cardholders become, and the harder it becomes to unravel this arcane system that is costing Canadian businesses $5 billion per year. The credit card companies' return from a restaurant meal already can be as high or higher than the restaurant operator who creates the jobs and makes the community investments. In addition, the restaurant operators must also pay credit card fees on the sales tax they collect on behalf of governments, as well as the tips that customers leave for restaurant staff, revenue streams that the restaurant operator cannot access or control. Card issuers collect $40 million, more than $40 million annually in merchant fees on the sales tax portion of the restaurant bill alone. As a result, Restaurants Canada urges government to ensure the budget commitment on credit card acceptance fees results in a significant reduction. We're looking forward to that this week. Ideally, we would like to see a regulatory cap on interchange fees with rules preventing the introduction of other merchant fees to recoup lost interchange revenue. And we would like you to stop credit card companies from profiting from taxes collected on behalf of government. And payroll taxes. Our members have consistently identified payroll taxes as an obstacle to job creation because they are a tax on jobs, but they are also the most regressive form of taxation. Those individuals at the lower end of the payroll scale pay the highest amount proportionately. According to the 2014 budget EI operating account projections, the EI account will have a $2.4 billion surplus in 2015-16 and a $6.4 billion surplus the following year. This provides government with an opportunity to restructure this payroll tax to make it less regressive. EI premiums place a disproportionate tax burden on lower income earners and have a particularly negative effect on the labor-intensive restaurant industry. They provide a disincentive to hire young, inexperienced workers whose tax rates compared to their wages is disproportionately high. A year's basic exemption would be the most efficient and cost-effective way to deliver payroll tax relief to the groups most affected. Similar to the 3,500 years basic exemption in the Canada and Quebec pension plans, the YBE refers to the annual earnings in which premiums are not applied and not to the first $3,500 of earnings. Currently, employees earning less than $2,000 per year can apply for a full EI premium refund. Those employees earning slightly more than $2,000, however, cannot, despite having no chance of qualifying for EI benefits. Only two-thirds of the individuals eligible for the rebate actually receive it. In addition, the existing rebate applies only to employees and not to employers. As a result, Restaurants Canada recommends that government restructure the EI premium system to include a year's basic exemption similar to the CPP QPP YBE.
Thank you.
As a way to alleviate the tax burden on low-income Canadians and assist employers to expand payroll to provide more young people with entry-level positions and retain them in these jobs. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation. We'll now go to the Portfolio Management Association of Canada, please.
Thank you. Mon nom est Scott Mahaffey. Je préside.
My name is Scott Mahaffey, and I'm the chair of the Industry Regulation and Tax Committee for my association. I'm a manager of Canadian Portfolios. I'm here with the president of PMAC.
Across Canada that manage total assets in excess of $900 billion, not including mutual fund assets, and $1.3 trillion when mutual funds are taken into account. PMAC members manage investment portfolios for, among others, private individuals, foundations, and pension plans. Our recommendations focus on how to improve Canada's taxation and regulatory regime with the overriding principle that there should be fairness for Canadian investors. PMAC is focused on various advocacy initiatives that are critical to improving Canada's taxation policy on investments and retirement savings. I'd like to highlight two tax policy areas where we believe better taxation fairness can be achieved for Canadian investors. One of PMAC's recent advocacy priorities has been with regard to the negative impact of the trust loss restriction rules on investment funds that were contained in the federal 2013 budget and the impact of these rules on Canadian unit holders. In simple terms, these rules extend the application of the acquisition of control rules as they currently apply to corporations to apply to trusts, including investment funds that are formed as trusts. The objective of the trust loss restriction rules is to prevent the use of arm's-length loss trading transactions that have been developed and that purport to enable one taxpayer to access the unused losses of another. These rules unfairly capture legitimate commercial trust activities in an industry that represents collectively $1.3 trillion in assets under management. Through various submissions to the Department of Finance, the Minister's Office, industry associations such as ours were able to work collaboratively on a solution to meet the policy objectives of finance, as well as eliminate the punitive and unfair impact of these rules on Canadian investors invested in these types of funds. We applaud the federal government for its recent announcement that it will provide relief to investment funds from the application of the rules. We do, however, believe there may still be some gaps to the proposed relief that will continue to be unfair for certain investors in certain types of funds, and we will work with finance staff going forward for further revisions to the proposed relief. Another example where we believe more taxation fairness for Canadian investors can be achieved is the application of GST and HST on investment management services for retirement savings. Canadian investors should not be taxed for actively planning for their retirement. GST and HST is a consumption tax. In our view, building retirement savings is the opposite of consumption, and accordingly, we fundamentally disagree with the idea that Canadians should pay taxes on services designed to help them build their retirement savings. We recommend that the federal government work with the provinces to adopt policy positions taken elsewhere in the world and exempt consumption taxes on investment management services. Or, in the alternative, work with the provincial governments to remove or mitigate the additional and uneven provincial portion of HST immediately. In the area of regulatory harmonization, PMAC is a strong supporter of a robust, efficient, and globally competitive regulatory regime. We've long supported a national securities regulator and commend the government and its provincial partners on its progress and commitments towards creating the cooperative capital markets regulatory system. The creation of the CCMR is a major improvement to the securities regulatory regime in Canada. It addresses the interests of Canadian investors and capital market participants and benefits all Canadians. PMAC has long argued that the existing framework of a fragmented securities regulatory system is out of step with global standards and does not serve Canadians well. We urge the government to continue working towards participation by all provinces. Finally, I would like to commend the government for its commitment to ensuring secure retirement for Canadians in moving towards various pension savings options that allow alternatives to current plans. Thank you. We believe harmonization of pension options should be a policy priority. We also urge the government to consider funding flexibility as a necessary priority with Canada's longer mortality rates. Finally, we applaud the federal government's recent announcement to move forward with the modernization of the pension investment rules that were contained in the Federal Pension Benefits Standard regulations first proposed in 2009. PMAC thanks the committee for the opportunity to make these submissions. On vous remercie.
Thank you very much for your presentation. We'll now hear from Tax Executives Institute Incorporated, please.
Thank you and good afternoon. I'm the Tax Director for AstraZeneca Canada, but appear today as the Vice President for Canadian Affairs for the Tax Executive Institute. TI is the preeminent association of business tax professionals worldwide. Our 7,000 members work in-house for 3,000 of the largest companies in Canada, the U.S., Europe, and Asia. My comments are endorsed by TI's approximately 900 Canadian members and other members whose firms have significant operations and investments in Canada. The government's efforts to decrease the corporate income tax rate and broaden Canada's tax base have made our system globally competitive, increasing Canada's attractiveness to investors. By encouraging the provinces to adopt harmonized tax policies, substantial administrative savings have been realized by the federal and provincial governments. But Canada must remain vigilant as other countries restructure their tax systems, implement rate reductions, lower marginal effective tax rates. In addition, the government should continue to reduce red tape and paperwork, increase electronic filing of tax forms, and ensure the CRA is well-funded and streamlined in its audit and appeals procedures to maximize the efficiency of tax administration. Despite progress towards a competitive tax system, there is unfinished business. In 2008, the Advisory Panel on Canada's System of International Taxation made two important recommendations that have not yet been addressed. First, the panel recommended repealing the current process for issuing waivers of withholding taxes under Regulations 105 and 102, and replacing it with a self-certification system for obtaining treaty benefits. Time does not permit me to explain why the current waiver process is not working. The Advisory Panel's 2008 report does that. A self-certification system for treaty benefits based on current information reporting requirements will maintain CRA's enforcement capability, but it will shift the compliance burden and cost to the certifying party. TI urges adoption of the panel's recommendations for treaty benefit self-certification. Second, the Advisory Panel recommended the Canada-U.S. tax treaty be renegotiated to eliminate withholding taxes on dividends between related companies. The United States has negotiated a nil withholding rate for group dividends under many of its tax treaties, and TEI recommends steps be taken to ensure that Canadian residents benefit in the same way as residents of other U.S. treaty partners. Our final recommendation relating to Canada's international tax system is to go slow in adopting the OECD's recommendations to curb perceived base erosion and profit shifting, known as BEPS. Over the last several budgets, the government has already undertaken actions curbing base erosion, effectively implementing a Made in Canada BEPS action plan. Those actions include adopting limitations on interest deductibility, curbing hybrid mismatches, and enhancing disclosure rules for aggressive tax planning. Also, Canadian taxpayers are required to provide substantial documentation of their foreign operations, which permits the CRA to conduct risk assessments with respect to transfer pricing. Because of varying economic conditions, budget constraints, and tax policies of participating countries, the OECD's recommendations may exacerbate the current patchwork of international tax rules, making it even more burdensome for taxpayers to comply while increasing the risk of multiple taxation. To avoid undermining Canada's tax system, TI recommends implementing OECD's BEPS recommendations only after careful consideration of their impact on the economy. Our final recommendation is to improve the administration of the tax system by according CRA authority to settle disputes based on risk of litigation. In 1997, the Technical Committee on Business Taxation pointed out that because of the costs, delays, and uncertainties involved in resolving issues at trial, it can be a benefit to all parties to achieve compromise solutions. TI concurs that under a risk of litigation approach, a fair and impartial resolution can be reached that reflects on an issue-by-issue basis the probable results in the event of litigation, or one which reflects mutual concessions for the purpose of settlement based on the relative strength of the opposing positions. Large taxpayers are frustrated at their inability to resolve disputes with the CRA at both the appeals and audit level. Besides the uncertainty surrounding appeals and litigation, large corporations must pay 50% of the tax in dispute when it's reassessed. Prepaying amounts that may be refunded is a significant drain on financial resources that can otherwise be invested in the business and promote employment. More tools are needed to enable taxpayers in the CRA to resolve disputes quickly. We believe our recommendation is one such step. TI thanks the committee for the opportunity to participate in this hearing, and I'll be pleased to respond to any questions from the panel.
Okay, thank you very much for your presentation. Colleagues, we will begin with Mr. Cullen, and we'll do 7-minute rounds for as far as we can go.
Thank you, Chair.
Mr. Cullen.
Thank you to all our witnesses. Ms. Yalnizyan, I'll start with you and try to sum up a bit of what you were saying just in terms of some of the fiscal risks to the Canadian budget that were also reiterated by Minister Oliver with regards to low oil prices, international threats to growth, and the government's decisions to embed in this coming budget some very expensive items, income splitting being one that stands out, as well as their plans that have been introduced in this Budget Implementation Act that we're dealing with right now around taking money out of the Employment Insurance Fund to use as a potential job growth strategy. I wondered if you could talk to me first about what the general threat is about making these fiscal decisions as the government faces what it projects to be approximately a $10 billion surplus, given those realities of the global and Canadian economy and the risks to revenue for the Canadian Treasury.
What I can say is what I did say, which is that just the simple drop in oil prices since July, which is the last time that our growth rate was downgraded, could have up to a $4 billion direct round effect on federal revenues alone. I'm not including second round effects of what that does to construction plans for expanding further construction and development of oil. What we do know is that we are also committed not only to tax cuts, but to working with our allies to fight ISIL. And undoubtedly, the events of last week will mean there will be more expenditures on security measures for Canadians here at home, and in particular in this wonderful establishment that is all Canadians' home. So I'm thinking that tax cuts have a very distant third or fourth role to play in what it is that needs to be considered to attain and maintain a budgetary balance, which is the goal of this government.
So, thank you. I want to talk about income inequality for a moment. You've made reference that in recent reports that the personal income tax exemption, so taking low-income Canadians off the tax roll versus helping raise wages, is there a comparison or a question to be made for government? We recently introduced the idea for federally regulated employees over time increasing that minimum wage versus what the government sometimes offers and says, well, we'll look to take people off the tax roll at the lower end. Is there any comparison, or is that an apples and oranges situation when considering tax measures?
Taking people off the tax roll at this stage at the lower end will not necessarily reduce poverty. It will basically reward people that have figured out how to do aggressive tax planning, and it will further reward them. What happens when you raise wages, however, is that you do get a multiplier effect with respect to consumer ability to sustain the economy. You could make the argument that reducing taxes or increasing the threshold at which one is taxed would do the same thing, that it would give you more purchasing power, but the multiplier effect is much greater in terms of raising wages and reaches people that could actually spend more money rather than people that are already at the edge and would be just using it to pay off debt.
You mentioned this in your commentary, but I wonder if there's any specifics around what are sometimes referenced as boutique tax credits, something that the folks that do our accounting for us in this country wrestle with every day, and they're very expensive in terms of a regulatory burden on Canadians filing taxes and also businesses. Has there been any assessment, to your knowledge, of what's called the free rider effect on some of these boutique tax credits? You made reference to offering tax credits to incentivize people to do something they were going to do anyways, which is sometimes called the free rider effect. Government reduces the revenue to encourage people to do something that, in effect, doesn't have any impact on what we were hoping to have an impact on, whether it's kids in sports or attending music programs and whatnot. Have you seen any federal government assessment, or has your group done any assessment on what percentage of people taking advantage of those tax credits were doing so and going to perform those activities anyways?
There was an appendix in the tax expenditures report from Finance of 2013 that indicated who it was that was taking advantage of the tax-free savings account, that indicated that the people that were most benefiting were people that already had excess money and that were older and richer. That was the highest proportion. Also, Tammy Sherrill, I think, I might be incorrect in that, but the University of Waterloo economist Tammy Sherrill indicated that, or it could be Kevin Milligan out of UBC, indicated that income splitting, the Universal Child Benefit Credit had the impact of keeping more parents at home, which might have been, in fact, its intended effect. But the point is, at a time when the economy is slowing, you do not want to pull money out of the system that could be used to spend, which would increase economic growth, or have more people not work than work, because you're worried about this continuous, like what Stephen Poloz, the Bank of Canada governor, calls serial disappointments in growth rates, which we are likely to see for as long as the eye can see, in addition to which, at the end of that, is population aging, which will also continue.
So having less participation, particularly by women in the workforce, would be a further drag on Canada's effective economy?
I think there's not much argumentation on that.
Well, apparently there's some policy argumentation, because that's what the government looks to do with their income splitting program. I wonder, over to you, Mr. Reynolds, for just a moment. It'll have to be very quick. Very interesting about credit card companies making more than some of your member associations. You didn't mention it, and maybe it's too hot a topic, but the changes to the Temporary Foreign Worker Program that have been embedded now in Budget Implementation Act, so it's become a budgetary item. What's the Restaurant Association's opinion in terms of the impact on the changes that the government has proposed to this point and going ahead with this particular program?
Well, as everybody knows, we've got a very mixed labour market here in Canada. We have red-hot Alberta, where our members are actually having to reduce hours of operation. They're having to close down parts of their business. The burnout rate, once their temporary foreign workers goes home, in terms of the owners, operators, in terms of the staff, is such that the businesses are going to become unsustainable. And again, this is a very, very regional issue. There are markets where it is really, really critical that there is something else. If there's not the temporary foreign worker program, then what?
Okay. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Cullen. We'll go to Mr. Keddy for 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome to our witnesses. Mr. Howlett, from your submission, you question the benefits of keeping taxes low. And specifically, you were critical about the $43 billion in corporate tax relief. At the same time, you're a little less clear on the total $160 billion of tax relief to small business and individuals. And you know, the reality is that we made a decision as a government to keep corporate taxes low and to keep personal taxes low. We went into the worst recession we faced since the Great Recession. And I believe because we had lower tax rate, we were a more attractive place to invest. And at the end of the day, we came out of the recession in better shape than our G7 neighbors. So how does your argument that somehow the $43 billion in corporate tax relief didn't help us weather the recession, how does that work?
Well, a 2011 Finance Department report on the impact of the government's action plan in response to the global recession concluded that investments in infrastructure had a 1.6 multiplier effect, but tax cuts were the least effective. In fact, they had a 0 or even negative multiplier effect, depending on whether it was corporate tax cuts or individual tax cuts. So even the Finance Department recognizes that tax cuts are about the worst way to try to stimulate the economy.
You are aware, of course, that the multiplier effect, and if you talk to the municipalities and businesses across this country who were receiving an incentive to build, couldn't afford to build any more than they already had on their plate. I mean, in my part of the world, the provincial government had to wait for its own tax share revenue to raise revenue to build their portion of their infrastructure builds. So I just find that argument a bit disingenuous, but I really want to ask you another question on the 10 offshore tax havens you talk about. You're talking about $170 billion in what you refer to as 10 offshore tax havens. Yeah, and you say that 2 Statistic Canada data tables, one of which is entitled International Investment Position, Canadian Direct Investment and Foreign Direct Investment in Canada by country, which seems to be where you found most of your data. And my question specifically is that, you know, Canadians are allowed to invest their money however they want. We don't encourage people hiding their money in offshore accounts, but certainly you would have to agree that so long as it's done within the law and revenues are being reported on their tax returns, that these 10 countries in particular aren't illegitimate countries and Canadians shouldn't be able to do business with them.
The Statistics Canada figures are probably a low estimate because they only really cover the actual legal investments in tax havens. They don't capture the large amount of illegal investments, mainly made by private individuals, wealthy individuals. And so it's true that this figure is largely the corporate investments, but much of that is, if not tax evasion, it is tax avoidance. And it is designed in most cases to lower their tax paid to the Canadian and provincial governments. So it is a problem, and what we're just pointing out, it is a growing problem. And what the government has done to date is not sufficient, and more needs to be done in that regard.
Well, maybe it's a question of clarity of language, because you specifically picked out these 10 countries, and I mean, surely you can't believe that Canadians shouldn't be allowed to invest in places like Hong Kong and Ireland and in Singapore, because those are 3 of the countries that you've named. And we're not talking, this is legal investment with taxes paid on that investment. So I want to be clear that you're not suggesting Canadians shouldn't be allowed to invest legally with open investment in those areas and pay tax on that investment.
Well, this is where we are supporting an action plan to tackle tax havens that includes greater transparency about what exactly those investments are. One of the big problems is that the investments don't stay in those countries, they go on to other places, but they go through those countries in order to lower their taxes. And that is happening globally, and that's why the OECD and the G20 are going forward with this OECD BEPS action plan, which needs to be implemented, and hopefully by the end of 2015 we'll have a completed plan, and Canada should support it and implement those recommendations.
Well, whether the OECD plan is perfect or not, I'm not quite certain, but CRA's, I want to ask you a little bit about CRA's voluntary disclosure program. Because, you know, the program has worked well, and for those who have not been entirely truthful, you know, I mean, let's be clear, on their taxes, it allows them to come forward before they're caught by CRA. They can correct the record by paying their taxes and any interest that they owe on those back taxes while avoiding stiff penalty. And what we've seen is a deluge of folks who have formerly been involved in a foreign tax haven coming forward, you know, with great numbers and paying their back taxes to avoid penalty.
Okay.
So do you agree with
Just
that?
a very
Yes,
brief,
we
very
are
brief response.
pleased that more people are coming forward, and I think it's a result not only of some of the measures government has taken, but the media attention to this issue and our efforts to make this a public issue. So that has had a positive effect. I would agree with you on that.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Kitty. We'll go to Mr. Chan for 7 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, witnesses, for all of your presentations. My question will first go to Ms. Reynolds from the Restaurants Canada Association. I had the pleasure, by the way, of meeting with some of your members last week, and of course you made, I think, a very forceful presentation with respect to your members' concern with respect to the high rate of credit card acceptance fees. In fact, Canada probably has one of the highest credit card acceptance fees around the world. And our party certainly agrees with the Competition Tribunal's position that we need some form of a regulatory framework with respect to managing credit card processing fees. I'm probably one of the most guilty individuals with respect to these loyalty cards, which is why my wallet is as big as it is, because I myself am equally captured by the attractiveness of all of these benefits from various loyalty programs. But the Minister of Finance had discussed the fact that the government's voluntary approach, the code of conduct for credit card and debit fees, was working. Do you have a particular comment with respect to that, or do you think that there needs to be a different approach, and how would that approach take place?
Well, I do think that the code of conduct has been very useful and helpful in terms of helping to maintain our very low-cost debit card system here in Canada. We were threatened with Visa and MasterCard debit cards that would start to that would be a percentage-based fee, even though the money would go directly from your account to the bank, of having these sort of loyalty programs that would be built into the debit card system, and we have actually amongst the lowest debit card fees in the world. So I would say that it has been very, very helpful in that regard. But as I said, we've been trying to rein in credit card fees since 2008, and they've just continued to grow and grow and grow. And Canadians, particularly higher income Canadians, have become addicted to the benefits. And it's come to the point that merchants, whether you're a retailer or a restaurant, you're going to lose the business if you say you'll only take cash. They really don't have any choice but to just accept these very, very high fees. So, you know, what we have determined, similar to the Competition Tribunal, that a voluntary approach isn't going to work, because this is something that's been pursued since 2008. It's time for government to intervene.
Great, thank you. I wanted to turn to the issue in some of your discussion with respect to the EI tax credit. And of course, the government has proposed its small business jobs tax credit that would only apply to firms that have a payroll of less than $15,000 in EI taxes. And a number of economists have indicated that there is essentially a design flaw because it essentially acts as a disincentive for businesses to grow. Liberals instead have proposed getting rid of this particular ceiling. Instead, have suggested providing an EI holiday for businesses that create new jobs. What's your particular view on these two particular proposals? Which do you think actually will ultimately produce more jobs?
Well, we actually have proposed an alternative to both those proposals. Building on the youth hires the new hires program that your government has proposed, we like the youth hires program that your government had in place a number of years ago. The current tax credit program, it does benefit some of our members, but it tends to benefit the small restaurant. If you want to expand to a second restaurant, it's not going to be as beneficial. But the year's basic exemption is a proposal that had all party support back in the time when the EI fund was in surplus, and it was endorsed by all parties around from the Human Resources Standing Committee as well as the Finance Committee. But the government hasn't been in a position to be able to implement it because there hasn't been that kind of surplus in the account for some time. Now that we're approaching a surplus in the account, the opportunity presents itself again to have all parties agree to a year's basic exemption that really would make the EI system fair for those at the lower end of the income scale as well as to labor-intensive employers.
Okay, thank you. My next question is to Ms. Yelnitsan. Apologize for butchering your last name. And by the way, thank you very much for your very generous opening comments. Your organization actually put out a report in January called Income Splitting in Canada, Inequality by Design. Can you expand upon your thoughts with respect to the government's proposed position on income splitting and why you think this is a particularly inefficient use of taxpayer resources?
That report indicated, and was, by the way, mirrored by one from the CD Howe, so across the political spectrum, the analysis seems to be there's not many ways of analyzing the original proposal, and I underscore original because it does sound like the Conservative Party is having a rethink on how to spend, on how to introduce an income splitting proposal. But that $3 billion would be only at the federal level. It would entail $1.9 billion of costs for the provincial governments as well. Only 9% of Canadian families with young children would benefit. They would tend to be upper income. It's just an awful lot of money going for something that I think a lot of people want to see is the families that can afford to spend more time at home with their kids would love to do so. So I think the argument is not just childcare, and it isn't just higher wages. It is like it's something that lets young families actually have more choice in the way they raise their families. It would be fantastic so long as you're not already creating advantages for those who are the most advantaged in our society.
Thank you.
Okay. You've got about 10 seconds, Mr. Chan.
Okay, very quick one then. Your organization also released a report called Help Not Wanted about cuts to student jobs in the federal government. What impact do you think this has had on young Canadians?
Time is up, but I'll give you a very brief response now, and we can come back to it.
I would recommend that everybody read the report.
Okay, that's a very good brief response. We will go to Mr. Allen. You'll have 7 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for being here today. And Ms. Yelnitsan, I appreciate your comments as well, and I feel very thankful I'm here to ask questions today. So I will start with Ms. Reynolds from Restaurants Canada because it was a little bit like listening at the end of it like you were on helium and you were trying to finish so fast around some of the payroll tax suggestions you were going to have. You did cover, to Mr. Chan's question, some your thoughts on the year's basic exemption. I seem to think there was more there. You were going very quickly. Were there more things that you were talking about from the EI side? And based on the year's basic exemption, can you indicate to us what the cost of that would be to the EI fund for that initiative?
It would depend on if you match the year's basic exemption in the Canada Pension Plan at $3,500, or if you started more modestly at $2,000, which is the level of the tax credit right now. So it would be somewhere around $1.2 billion.
Were there other initiatives when you talked about payroll taxes, especially on the EI side, when you talked about restructure to make it less regressive? Were there other items you were thinking about there?
Well, our key concern is to, because we are such a labor-intensive business, and because it's such a significant cost for our members, we're looking at ways to make it not so taxing for our members to hire more young people. We're the #1 first-time job provider of any industry in the country. We have, as we discussed previously, we have some regions of the country where we have real challenges finding anybody to work in our industry. And then we have other regions of the country where we know that there are young people that are reaching the age of 25 who've never held a single job, and that we typically play the role of providing those all-important soft skills to those people that want to sort of a springboard to the larger labor force. Those people that are reaching the age of 25 who've never held a single job have a lot more difficulty than those people who have gained experience working as students and teenagers in our sector, and we'd like to hire more.
Okay, thank you very much. Mr. Mahaffey, I have a couple of questions for you. One of the comments you brought up in your pension innovation and modernization was urge the government to consider funding flexibility as a necessary priority with Canada's longer mortality rates. We've had some presentations in previous committee meetings which have talked about changing the RIF rules and those types of things. Is that what you're referring to, or are you talking about other things?
To a degree, yes, that is what we're talking about. But in addition, and I can't speak to this with a great degree of expertise, but I want every option explored. I think we need to consider many different ways in which to encourage Canadians to save through different policy alternatives, especially in the pension framework. And I think we need to consider the pension regulations much more carefully when we're looking at the bigger picture. I think they're often forgotten. I think income tax and pension regulations are at odds at times. And I really think to take a much more harmonized approach when we look at savings, whether there be retirement savings or pension savings, needs to be done.
Specific suggestions on that your association could table with the committee?
I do not at this time. I'm happy to take this back to discuss with my colleagues and present something in the near future.
Very near future.
Point by point, very near future.
Yeah, that would be very helpful. One of the things you talked about also was the consumption, removing the consumption tax on investment services. And I just wonder what the practicality of that is when you look at do you know what the cost of that would be? How risky would that be? And I share with you also that we also have accounting fees for doing taxes, and all those are subject to tax as well. By removing one, aren't you suggesting we remove all the others? And does that start us down a very slippery slope?
Well, thank you for the question. I believe would be for someone else to maybe argue that we remove all of the others. And in terms of the absolute quantum we'd be discussing, I can't speak to that right now. What we are suggesting, however, is that those consumptions, that consumptive behavior will occur. This is just deferring it for the future. To reduce or eliminate the taxes in those areas will give Canadians more money to reinvest, have greater retirement savings, and be able to consume at the time of retirement, whether for their families, help put their children or grandchildren through university, and the taxes can be affected at that stage.
Okay, Mr. McGrath, a couple for you. When you talked about the red tape reduction, CRA especially, what are some of the major initiatives that you see from a red tape reduction in CRE that have played the most benefit to the tax executives, and which logical steps would you see as being next? You talked about one in terms of settlement on risk-based litigation. That obviously would be one. But what would you see as others that would leverage on what we've already done in CRA?
There's
many different things done.
There's 1 minute remaining in the rounds.
Okay. Yeah, and on that front, I mean, there's a couple of things that we've addressed in our paper around, again, electronic filing requirements and broadening that to include some of the tax forms that are currently filed manually and may be filed manually even though your basic tax return gets filed electronically. The T106 form on reporting transactions with foreign-related non-residents, as well as the T1134 forms. Again, making those electronic would save a lot of the extra work that we're doing in completing those and having them submitted, and also obviously for CRA because they would be receiving those and doing statistical analysis based on those. As far as the CRA, creating an ombudsman, which would allow us to have oversight from their perspective on the risk of litigation, as well as provide us with a step in between the appeals and the audit function. Okay. I think would be a great help for taxpayers.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Allen. Monsieur Caron, pour 7 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Merci beaucoup. Merci également à l'ensemble des panélistes. Monsieur McGrath, je vais commencer avec vous.
To all of the panelists, Mr. McGrath, I will begin with you. I would like to discuss your third recommendation, which states that because the Canadian government has made some progress, fiscal progress, with respect to the erosion of the tax base and the transfer of profits, we should diminish or reduce the OCDE's project. It is clear that the OECD project was clear and it makes recommendations and it meets a need, particularly at the coming of the large recession. It's a project that requires coordination at the national level, and at a time when it's easy to move money digitally from one country to another very quickly. How can we be sure that because there are some initiatives that we should stop international coordination? And I think that all experts, particularly after the requisition, said that there had to be greater coordination. Can you please reconcile the fact that Canada is taking steps in the right direction, perhaps, but perhaps that doesn't mean that there still doesn't have to be a coordination at the international level? Mr. McGrath.
Alors, la recommandation que vous aviez, c'était que...
Recommendation was that because progress had been made with respect to tax erosion and we should stop the rate at which we are adopting the recommendations made under the OECD project. In my opinion, one can be done and the other can be done. We need international coordination. Why should we stop the rate, the rhythm of adopting these recommendations? We could adopt those as the subject of consensus, and at a time where capital is moving much more quickly. And why are you arguing that we should slow down?
I agree that we need to look at all of the BEPS action points, and it's just a matter of considering the impact on the economy and the differing economic policy decisions being made by different countries around the world. Capital is very fluid, and capital is, as we've seen, being moved around the globe. If we're looking at implementing policies in Canada, how does that impact our competitiveness and the competitiveness of our tax policies compared to, again, other places where that capital can flow? So it's not stopping necessarily the implementation. It is just making sure that we consider what the impact on the economy will be.
C'est un argument qui peut être utilisé par chacun des pays.
But this is an argument that can be used by each country that looks at the recommendations. If those recommendations are adopted by the larger group of members, if you look at the argument concerning the impact that will have nationally, if it's adopted by most of the countries, and if the other countries do the same type of thing, there would have to be better coordination.
Members are basically concerned with ensuring that we have consistent application and consensus among the OECD countries and the G20, and that it is a fair and even playing field. and then at that point, the risks of double taxation and things along those lines would be mitigated.
Merci. Monsieur Mahaffey, merci pour votre présentation.
Thank you for your presentation. When you talk about the sales tax on savings, this is not necessarily a sales tax on savings per se, as it is on the services that procure the savings, say investment companies. There are contributions that are made through the CPP or other bodies. There is no type of sales tax, but there are sales taxes, if you like, on brokerage fees through the middlemen. But the tax then would apply for those brokers that would internalize the tax. Would there be another type of possibility that you could perhaps think of rather than just eliminating the sale tax? Because really this is a tax on savings.
Is there another alternative in any area, in any industry, that would replace the income lost if we were to remove the GST, HST on management fees?
Mm-hmm. What I'm saying is that you're saying it's a tax on savings. Mm-hmm. Another way of seeing it would be it's a tax on the service that's provided to the saver, which is from brokerage firms, for example.
To be clear, these are on investment management fees, and we want to encourage, and I think everyone wants to encourage Canadians to save for their retirement.
That's right.
Yeah, in seeking out professional counsel to assist them maximize those savings going forward, we think it really will help all Canadians to not be hit with this tax on an annual basis, on a quarterly basis, but rather at the time they actually choose to withdraw that money and actually consume services or goods. We think that's the appropriate time to simply defer.
J'ai le temps pour une question rapide. Vous êtes en faveur d'un organisme?
I have a quick question, time for a quick question. The regulatory body that you discussed, there is a cooperative organization that has been put forward by the federal government, but there is a problem involved with that. Alberta and Quebec are very strongly opposed to having a broad regulatory system. In the event that they aren't convinced about it, could one not look at a type of cooperative organization on the one hand, where the significant players might be outside of the system, where they might not join the actual regulatory system? What are your thoughts on that?
And as you know, currently through our CSA, the Canada Security Administrators, we do have a number of national instruments that go across the country. There are, however, gaps in that. So I have concerns, and we have concerns, that it's sort of a two-tiered system where some are members of the cooperative group and others are on the outside, and participating and agreeing on certain initiatives will only create greater regulatory gaps and greater confusion among investors, and a single regulator is still the best solution.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Merci. We will go to Mr. Van Kesteren. This will be the last 7-minute round.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you all for coming back. Good to see some of you as repeat offenders, others as newbies, and we're sure glad if I can make one recommendation, and please don't take this wrong, but it is really important that we get these reports before you present them. So if you could make sure that we get your report before, the reason is, you know, we got guys like Mr. Allen over here that's understands a lot of these terms. I'm speaking now more, although your reports were here, and I'm not here to lecture you, but it just is that much more important that we can go over them and then ask those questions. But I do appreciate you coming every year and presenting before this committee. We certainly do value your input. We heard from Armine, I'm going to say Armine if you don't mind, and Dennis, just in your opening remarks.
We're making eye contact here. I know who you're talking about.
Your feelings on why it was not necessarily a good thing to lower corporate taxes. And so I'm not asking you to respond to that. because we heard your presentation, and it was you know, I think you made your point. I want to ask the other three participants what their feelings are, because just obviously they might have a different take. Ms. Reynolds, what do you feel about corporate taxes and individual taxes? Would you agree that our government's efforts in lowering taxes for individuals and families is important? Is it something we should continue on? Go ahead.
Absolutely. We are. One of the things about our industry is we've got skinny margins in our industry, so that's why I focused on payroll taxes, because they're a tax before profits. But both the small business tax and the corporate tax make a difference in terms of investment in equipment. I told you we had 1.1 million jobs in our industry. We have another 250,000 spin-off jobs, companies that provide everything from, you know, linens to tables, designers. We have big supporters of the construction industry. And if we want to expand our industry, and we're an industry that has been expanding for quite some time, we need to have money to invest. And so absolutely it makes a huge difference to our sector.
Mr. Mahaffey and Ms. McGrath, would you agree? You're in a different line of work. Sometimes maybe you're approaching maybe people.
Work, to be sure, and I can't speak with any great degree of expertise, but there's obviously a right balance to be struck. We encourage anything that will help Canada and Canadians grow their retirement savings to retire comfortably and with security, and also make the company attractive to the country attractive to investors from inside and outside of the country.
So I guess I'm asking you to comment on both the individual taxes being lowered and corporate taxes. Do they both? Is it true for one as for the other?
I don't have any empirical evidence to point to be able to support any specific numbers, but I certainly support anything that will lead to greater retirement savings.
Mr. McGrath, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, sure. Just into saying, thank you. It's a very good question, very broad indeed. TI doesn't oppose targeted spending increases, individual tax relief, or reductions in government spending and debt. That said, and TI commends the government on its efforts in commitment to a balanced budget, but that needs to be weighed against our tax competitiveness on a corporate basis. And ensuring that we remain in competition for mobile capital around the world. And as was brought up by the honourable member, the BEPS initiative addresses some of those imbalances that were perceived, and perhaps we can get to a more balanced result.
So in your industry, lowering the corporate taxes has been a positive. Has had a positive effect.
Correct. I would suggest in my industry lowering the corporate tax rate has been an advantage. Unfortunately, we've seen some cyclical changes in the pharmaceutical industry such that we've seen significant revenue reductions, but the incentives provided by this government and continue to be provided around research and development have allowed us to continue with the investment in innovation and jobs.
Thank you. Ms. Reynolds, I want to go back to you. I don't have much more time, but the great thing about getting these presentations before, and we can look over them, and we see a common theme sometime, and was an interesting proposition made by, I believe it was the Chamber, and they're going to appear before us next, to equal the payment between the employer and the employee for EI. Is that something you've talked about? Is that something that you would recommend as well, too? I wonder if you could just tell us about that.
Okay, about 1 minute remaining.
Yes, I did provide mine in advance, by the way.
Yes, I got you.
But yes, the 60-40. There's no reason for the 60-40 split. If you look at the EI benefits. Many of them are social benefits. The employer has no control over those social benefits. They become a larger and larger percentage of the EI benefits over time. At one point, the government paid 20%, employees paid 40%, and employers paid 40%. And it switched over to employers paying 60%. There's no reason that employers should be paying 1.4 times the amount that employees are paying.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Van Kesteren. We'll go to Mr. Rankin, and colleagues will go to 5-minute rounds.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to all of our witnesses. I'd like to begin, if I could, please, with Mr. Howlett of Canadians for Tax Fairness. In your presentation, you come back to a theme that's been around since the Carter Commission, which is usually expressed as a buck is a buck is a buck, and arguing against capital gains getting a break on taxation, treating it like any other kind of income. And then you also talk about the unfairness. You single out as the most unfair loophole the stock options deduction. So why do we have these? Has your research indicated why these discrepancies continue to exist? Is it because of reciprocity with the United States that has caused this to come into our tax law? Because it makes a lot of sense that you would treat all income the same, yet we don't, as you point out. Why?
A couple of things. One, there is increasing criticism of the stock option deduction from business as well. So we find, for example, the former head of the U of T Business School saying that this encouraged poor behavior by corporations. It encourages a short-term type thinking and runs counter to the interests of the companies themselves. And so there is increasing critique on the stock options deduction, even in business terms. They don't really provide any social or economic benefit. In fact, it's counterproductive in both cases. In terms of the differential treatment of income from investments, what we need to realize is that some investments do create jobs and should be encouraged, but more and more investments are actually speculative investments and do little or nothing, in fact, are counterproductive in terms of economic growth and economic development or job creation. And government needs to distinguish between these. There may have been a point to the treatment, the special treatment of investment income back in a day when stock markets were actually a source of capital investment. They no longer are a significant source of capital investment or job creation. So there really is no economic reason to give preferential treatment, and especially when you consider that the benefits of this, which cost a huge amount in terms of government expenditure, are going to the wealthiest citizens. And even Ms. Yellen from the United States is saying growing income inequality is bad for the economy. So we need to do something about closing the income gap. And these tax policies go exactly the opposite direction.
All right. For Ms. Yalnesian of the CCPA, thank you for your presentation. You had to go very quickly, so I want to make sure I grasp one of the first points you made about inheritance tax. You pointed out $1 trillion in wealth transfer coming up as baby boomers retire and die and the kids get the money. My question then is that your only recommendation? It appears to be to address that issue, that there be an inheritance tax implemented? And if so, don't we already have something like that with the deemed disposition on death, capital gains, etc.?
So we don't have an inheritance tax in Canada. I did make several suggestions. I'm just saying that the long game for your considerations today with respect to tax regulation and incidence of tax is to broaden the base. And broadening the base includes introducing something like an inheritance tax so that you are able to capture a little piece of what's about to move along in the next 20 years, because we're going to have a huge dependency ratio issue. And if you wait for 20 years to do anything about the tax base that you've got, you're going to be taxing the people that you're also asking to support, both the young and old then. So this is the moment to do this. And I did indicate, I think I got out that I was hoping that we could cap lifetime contributions as well as the tax-sheltered assets in tax-free savings accounts, which were introduced in January of 2009, and on full maturity will be a huge leakage in the good ship government. And I also had a recommendation about eliminating deductions for stock options and capital gains. You could tighten tax expenditures for scientific research and experimental development. And most importantly, you can broaden the base by enforcing the base more rigorously. And I tried to make the point that our ability to enforce is being tapped out in favor of reducing red tape. And if we needed compliance ever with the tax regulations, now's the time.
Thank you.
CRA, for example, and personnel at that point.
Not just the cuts to the CRA, but the reallocation of people that do reporting compliance being moved from international business and large businesses to small and medium enterprises.
Okay. Sorry, I'm just trying to be fair to all members here. We'll go very briefly to Mr. Adler, please.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you all for being here today. You know, we've had a very fulsome discussion over the last couple of weeks in terms of the forthcoming fiscal dividend and what policy options we should be pursuing in terms of either paying down the debt or finding new and creative ways of perhaps how to spend it so we can create more jobs and long-term prosperity for Canadians. But I do want to pursue, fortunately I don't have a lot of time, but I do want to pursue a couple of angles here. Number one is Ms. Reynolds with the Restaurants Canada. I was just, you mentioned before in your presentation about introduction of premium cards by credit card companies. Have you found with the introduction of premium cards, now a lot of credit card companies are doing this, they're getting the platinum and all kinds of different incarnations. Have you found that that has increased the level of spending, or it's just having the same level of spending but people just have more cards now?
I would say that people are using their cards more. So you have it used to be that you pretty much paid cash when you went to the grocery store or you went to a quick service restaurant. Now you use your credit card. You use your credit card for all kinds of expenditures that you didn't use.
Are you finding in the restaurants though that someone who had a MasterCard, say or I shouldn't use a name, but XYZ card before and is now and used that in a restaurant is now given a premium XYZ card, that person now spends more money, or they're spending the same amount of money as they did when they had the basic XYZ card?
From talking to our members, their experience is that it's not increasing how much they spend on the card.
Okay.
It's not, no.
Okay, thank you. That's what I need to know. Now, you also had indicated that you have 1.1 million employee direct jobs that you create within the restaurant industry, and 250,000 indirect jobs that are related to the restaurant industry. So you can clearly speak with some authority in terms of what it takes to create jobs. Now, lowering taxes, which we have done, corporate tax down to 15% federally, lowering of the GST from 7 to 6 to 5, putting more money in the pocket of Canadian families. Has that served the restaurant industry well? Number one, in terms of job creation. Number two, in terms of putting more money by EI premium cuts into the bank accounts of restaurant owners, that they can in turn use that money to reinvest and create more jobs. Can you answer both of those for me, please?
Yeah, I can agree with that statement, and I can also say that our members are also being faced with much higher costs in other areas as well, higher food costs, higher energy costs, and particularly higher labor costs. So, I don't know what kind of job creation we'd be able to provide, given that we probably are recognized as having some of the lowest margins of any sector, and
cuts are surely welcome.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Okay. Interprovincial trade barriers. Can you talk a bit about that? Because I know the restaurant industry has been pretty vocal on dismantling trade barriers, which we as a government have been very aggressive. We have all these, we've negotiated 43 since 2006 international bilateral trade agreements, yet within Canada, interprovincial trade is sometimes the restrictions are more stringent between provinces than they are between Canada and another country. Could you comment?
Alcohol would probably be the best example of that.
Yeah.
We also have problems with supply management and the differences between production allocation for chicken, for instance, is a big problem of ours. If there's anything that we would like to see addressed in terms of interprovincial trade barriers, it's got to be those associated with our supply management system.
Okay, 30 seconds.
30 seconds, okay. Ms. Yelnesian, just ask you quickly. You were asked by Mr. Chan earlier about the Liberal plan to eliminate EI premiums. Who owns EI? Who owns the money in the EI account?
Workers and employers.
Correct. Now, when the Liberals plundered it for $50 billion in the 1990s and early 2000s, and the Supreme Court ruled that was illegal. Okay. Is not what the Liberal Party is proposing now very similar to what happened back then?
A very brief response.
This is money that does not belong to the government, correct?
The rules are made by the federal government, including you. Now, you just introduced a tax cut, but you made the rules for that. So the federal government makes the rules but does not pay any of it.
The EI doesn't belong to the government.
Thank you. Thank
but you make the rules.
Thank you. I
didn't write that rule.
I suspect that's a longer discussion. You will continue over time. I just wanted to follow up on a couple of brief items to Mr. Mahaffey. In your presentation you made, not today, but your previous presentation to the committee, you talked about expansion of designated stock exchange in terms of what would be an eligible exchange for investors. You mentioned that there's a list of 40 exchanges, but this is too limited, and the government ought to look at expanding that list. I mean, can you just, for our information here today, sort of itemize some of the exchanges that the Canadian government ought to look at expanding to?
Thank you for the question. I appreciate you raising this topic. Just as a brief summary, there are a number of exchanges listed in the Income Tax Act to which registered investments may invest, and those are deemed to be the designated stock exchange. It is a very limited list, mostly North American and European exchanges. The world has been shifting. The global investments have increased, and yet not many exchanges have been added to that list over the last 20-25 years. For example, the Korean exchange is not on that list. A registered account cannot directly purchase a security such as Samsung. There are no South American exchanges. The Brazilian exchange is not on that. We encourage the government and the Department of Finance to find ways of adding more exchanges to the list of designated stock exchanges, allowing Canadians to better diversify their registered investment savings. But off the top of my head, Korea, Russian exchanges, Brazil would be good examples.
Okay, I appreciate that. And if you want to follow up with more suggestions, please do so to me, and I'll share that with all the committee.
Thank you.
I did want to ask, because I think there's been some interesting discussions about the stock option deduction, and I mean, on the face of it, I think Mr. Howland makes some strong points, but Mr. McGrath, from your perspective, from your organization's perspective, I don't know if it's fair to put you on the spot, but do you have any perspective on this deduction and whether the government ought to look at eliminating it?
Yes, no, it's a very good question. Unfortunately, TI really is looking at the policy and tax decisions more from the company's perspective as opposed to the individual taxpayer's perspective. So I don't know that we've got a position on the stock option benefit or any statistics around it.
Okay. I think in the interest of time and colleagues, we do have a motion we obviously want to deal with today, so unfortunately we're going to have to cut it there. But thank you all for coming in. It was a very good, lively discussion here this afternoon. So we will, colleagues, we will switch the panels, but I'm actually going to go right to Mr. Cullen and his motion right at this time while we switch the panel. So thank you all to our first panel of guests for being here. And Mr. Cullen, we will go to you to your motion, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Just one single motion, Chair, and I think all committee members should have a copy of the motion in front of them. Is that true, Mr. Chan, as well? Good. So as committee members will know, there was a bit of a mistake made at the Finance Department a little while ago. What seemed to be have taken place, and this has been confirmed by the Minister as well, is that there was a premature release of public information about the fall economic update. There were two primary concerns that were raised for us initially, because this has been alluded to before when Liberals were in government and concerns came from Conservatives in opposition at the time, and I'll speak very briefly. One was whether any potential impacts on the market. The information was up on the Finance Department's website, I think only for a few minutes, 15 minutes according to the Minister, and then was taken down. We didn't know what all the information contained. Essentially what was done was the wrong press release was sent out, but contained a number of details that was not in the forthcoming legislation. What appears to have then happened is that the Finance Department got that secondary piece of legislation ready quickly overnight, I assume, and then brought forward a motion in the House the next day to introduce it to catch up to what had been revealed publicly. Now, our first concern was impact on the market. Was anybody able to use the information that they were able to glean in those 15 minutes before withdrawn to take some advantage? I just received this now, Chair, a letter from the Minister that I'm happy to distribute because we'd written to the Minister to clarify first in terms of that concern around the impact on the market. I feel assured and satisfied with the Minister's response that an assessment has been taking place internally, that there was none, and I think the tax provisions that were accidentally released were unlikely to have any significant impact on anybody's investment decisions. The second question that I raised with him in my correspondence has not yet been addressed, and that's what this motion also deals with, is to invite the Minister to come forward to explain how is, to our witnesses, please come forward and make yourselves comfortable while I prattle on. To invite the Minister to come forward at a time that is convenient for him to be able to explain how this can't happen in the future, what specific measures are being taken internally to assure, because this, I would essentially say we got a bit lucky, Chair. If there had been some more substantive measures that had accidentally been released before legislation was presented in Parliament, even if it was for, as we all know, with the digital age that we live in, even if it had been 30 seconds, could have caused an advantage in the market and a distortion within the market in Canada, particularly large tax measures and particularly spending initiatives the government was going to do. Let's say they were, I don't want to take potentials, but just what we're dealing with right now. So that's the motion. It's, and I spoke to the Minister briefly today after question period to assure him this is not a, there's no political motivation in this. This is for the Finance Department to assure both us as committee members dealing with financial issues and the broader Canadian public and the market in particular that a slip of a computer mouse can't lead to the government releasing sensitive tax information well ahead of when the government has legislation ready and prepared to back it up. So that's what the motion says. We don't ascribe any particular date or a deadline, but it's something certainly that I would imagine is in the government's interest as well to say this is the way that this can't happen again, and let's be good rather than lucky when it comes to releasing financial information to the broader Canadian public. And that's it for me.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Cullen. I have Mr. Keddy on the list. I'll have Mr. Keddy. Okay, Mr. Keddy, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to quickly as possible just review a few of the points that Mr. Cullen has made. And, you know, he has been consulted by the Minister, and the Minister has also been extremely clear with the media on this issue and exactly what has happened. And, you know, Mr. Cullen, you state you're also satisfied with the Minister's answer. But I just want a few facts that just need to be stated. On October the 9th, shortly after the Prime Minister announced a significant enhancement to the Children's Fitness Tax Credit, Department's Consultations and Communications Branch posted online an incorrect news release on a Ways and Means motion that was not to be tabled until the following day. A link to the news release was sent to an electronic distribution list maintained by the Department. Though the earlier email would still be in the inboxes, the link became inoperative when the news release was removed from the website. So really there was little chance of real serious damage being done. And it was removed from the Department's website within 15 minutes. Because of the error, the Minister moved up the tabling of the Ways and Means to ensure the information was in the public domain. So he moved it ahead. and it was tabled the next day, October the 10th, with all the measures that were inadvertently released. And the minister also went further than that, instructed senior officials in the Department of Finance to implement additional safeguards to ensure such a lapse never happens again. So for me, you know, Mr. Cullen, with respect, you've been consulted. The minister's been also very clear in the media, plus I reiterated that again today. And you stated yourself that you're satisfied with the minister's remark. And the only other thing is there's a small mistake in your motion that that stated it was fall economic update, and then actually it was the Budget Implementation Act bill. But that's really all I have. So,
Mr. Keddy, we'll go to Mr. Cullen, please.
I just wanted to clarify one thing. Mr. Keddy is right in that we were satisfied with one of the two concerns that we raised, but we'd be mischaracterizing it to say that I was fully satisfied. To be fair, I just received a letter from the minister just a few minutes ago, in conversation, did read the media reports. It's this second part, not the market issue, that was raised and important, but I think it would be certainly reassuring to committee members, myself, and I can't speak for other members, but these very measures that the minister talks about having taken, I don't know what those are to ensure that they doesn't happen again. Committee members have to be aware of the significance of this. Not that this particular incident turned out to be significant, but to not have processes in place in the Finance Department, to not accidentally release, as Mr. Keddy properly points out, the Budget Implementation Act information before it's gone to Parliament. That has ramifications, could have serious ramifications depending on what gets released. So this is a question of just basic competence, and again, we want to be fair to the minister and to public officials. But the fact that this could have happened means it could happen again, unless we're reassured. And the two sentences in the letter I've received from the minister are certainly not enough, because I don't know what those measures are. All we have is that certain measures have been taken. I don't know what that is. I think it would give them, again, this is to give the minister the opportunity to clear the air and say, this is what we're doing, this is why it can never happen again, because I think we would at least all agree that this happening again would be hugely problematic if the substance of this information had been of a much more sensitive and impactful nature than it was over the fitness tax credit or the other things that were announced. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you. Colleagues, can I go to a vote on this motion, or is there further discussion required? Or?
Sorry,
Mr. Chan.
Clarification: is this? Are we amending the motion slightly to read to the Budget Implementation Act, or is it as it reads?
I have not received an amendment, so we're dealing with the motion as is.
The language, I think Mr. Keddy's point was fair. If it's okay to put an amendment forward contained in the Budget Implementation Act.
Yeah, you can't amend your own motion.
I can't amend my own motion. I wonder if Mr.
I'll move to
what are you
amend
moving, Mr. Rankin?
that there be an amendment to the motion to replace the language Fall Economic Update with Budget Implementation Act. I think that would do it, wouldn't it?
Okay, so the amendment is to replace Fall Economic Update with Budget Implementation Act. A discussion on the amendment, Mr. Chan?
No, just second the motion if necessary.
Okay. All in favor of the amendment to replace Fall Economic Update with Budget Implementation Act? All in favor of the amendment? Okay, well, all in favor of the amendment, please raise your hands.
Time here, Mr. Chairman. Really.
Okay, well, I'm getting to the amendment in the motion, so all in favor of the amendment, please raise your hands. For, all opposed. All right, the amendment is defeated. All in favor of the motion unamended. All in favor. 4, all opposed. 5, the motion is defeated. Thank you all for that discussion. I want to thank our guests, our witnesses, for your patience. We had to deal with the motion between the two panels. Thank you so much for being here with respect to our pre-budget consultations 2014. I'll just identify who we have before us. We have as an individual Mr. Gareth Kirkby. Welcome to the committee. We have the Canadian Bankers Association, the President, Mr. Terry Campbell. Welcome back. We have the Chartered Professional Accountants of Canada, the President and CEO, Mr. Kevin Dancy. We have from Deloitte, we have the Global Tax Policy Leader, Mr. Albert Baker. And from the Investment Industry Association of Canada, we have Mr. Brian Parker, who is the President and CEO of Acumen Capital Partners. Welcome to all of you. Thank you so much for being with us. You each have 5 minutes maximum for an opening statement, and then we'll have questions from members, and we'll start with Mr. Kirkby, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm here today to share with you the implications of the findings of my master's thesis. I interviewed 16 leaders of charities of various sizes in 5 sectors and 5 provinces, and also 5 charity experts. The leaders spoke, most on condition of anonymity, of the impact on their organizations of the threat of CRA audits for political activities, and the rhetoric of cabinet ministers since 2012, conflating charities with money launderers, criminal organizations, and even terrorist organizations. My study discovered that charities are being muffled in their communications and distracted from their publicly beneficial missions by these actions. Studies show most charities have less than 3% of their resources going toward political activities as seemingly defined by regulations. My data suggests that even those organizations targeted by CRA are on average well under the allowable 10% of resources devoted to political activities. Clearly, there is no obvious problem that needs addressing through stepped-up auditing. The pre-2012 auditing regime was sufficient. Few charities exceed political activity limits as they are generally understood, a fact confirmed by how few charities have publicly been identified by CRA as being out of line. This beggars the question as to why the government would devote $13.4 million to beef up political activity audits, while, to use a recent example, reassigning auditing staff pursuing genuine criminals like tax evaders who shift their money to offshore tax havens. I found that the government is using the tax collector to fight partisan battles against charities that have different public policy preferences to the government. Researchers who have long studied the voluntary sector have since 2012 found evidence of politicization of CRA. I'm not the first to warn that something is seriously amiss. My contribution is in detailing the effects of these on charities and on national conversations, and exploring some of the implications for the health of democracy. I would suggest that the clearly unnecessary new political activities audit program should be abandoned. Rather than finding a nest of cheating charities, this audit program is muffling and distracting charities from their missions that their citizen supporters presumably want them focused on. Charities are experts in their mission areas, and Canadians know that. The program is thus interfering with important national conversations about public policy choices, arguably at the very time in our history that we need the widest possible input from experts. A democratic society needs to hear all sides of an issue. Why my interview subjects kept asking, is our federal government afraid of vigorous national discussions? Some answered their own question, and that can be found in my thesis. I'd like to raise another major issue that came to light in my research. The lack of clear definitions of specific terms in the regulations leaves charities confused and receiving different advice from different lawyers. The examples posted on the CRA website for charities to apply to real-life situations, while acknowledging an improvement over the situation before 2002, are described by some charity leaders as naive and unhelpful. There are numerous gray areas open to too much interpretation, allowing people to stay in a state of confusion despite years of feedback about vague definitions and illustrations leads some leaders to think that this is intentional.
1 minute.
On top of that, some charity leaders believe that politicization of CRA since 2012 has resulted in these special audits using new interpretations of the regulations. Charities that have repeatedly passed previous in-depth auditing worry about results this time. That's a head-scratcher. Charities do important work that has historically had all-party support. This auditing program and the government's confrontational rhetoric is not helping address society's needs, and it is hurting all charities, including those beyond the targeted sectors. Thank you for inviting me today.
Thank you for your presentation. We'll hear from Mr. Campbell now, please.
Je vous remercie, Monsieur le Président.
I thank you, Mr. Chairman, for having invited me, and I'm very pleased to be attending this meeting today.
before I get into remarks, I would like to add the CBA's voice to the many thousands, millions of voices across the country who have expressed deep regret, deep sorrow at the shocking events which took place on Parliament Hill, the National War Museum, and in Quebec last week and the week before. And we join with all of you around this table offering our condolences to the families of those victims. So I would like to get into very briefly the recommendations that we have made in our pre-budget submission. I do this in the context, obviously, and you've heard me say this before, that Canada has some of the best managed and capitalized banks in the world, and also banks that are among the best regulated and supervised. We've had 7 straight years where Canada's banks have been rated the soundest in the world by the World Economic Forum. Now, of all the companies that Canadians have relationships, few are more personal and more important than the relationship they have with their bank. Canadians look to their bank to safeguard their money, help finance a home or business, manage their savings and investments, and plan their retirement. And our public opinion research shows that Canadians recognize this, and they trust and they value their banks. Overall, some 90% of Canadians have a favorable impression of their bank. And we contribute to the economy and the economic health of our country in many, many ways. We have authorized $940 billion in business lending, with some $200 million for small and medium-sized businesses. We provided $13.5 billion in dividend income to millions of Canadians through their pension plans, RSPs, and direct share ownership. And they employ more than 280,000 Canadians in communities all across the country. So that's the context of our remarks. Very briefly, I'll overview the recommendations we've made in our submission. First, we support the efforts by federal and provincial governments to strengthen their fiscal positions by returning to balanced budgets while maintaining a competitive tax environment. Second, and on the last point, we encourage the federal government to maintain its commitment to a competitive corporate tax rate, and we encourage the provinces to aim at and maintain a 10% target corporate income tax rate. We also look to provinces, those that remain with this provision, to eliminate existing capital taxes on financial institutions and to refrain from instituting new capital taxes. Thirdly, we encourage federal, provincial, and territorial governments to continue to work towards a reduction of trade barriers between jurisdictions, both within Canada and internationally. Fourth, we support the federal government's effort to have all provincial governments put in place legislation enacting a cooperative capital markets regulator as soon as possible. Our final recommendation is around the government's efforts to promote financial literacy in Canada. Financial literacy is a priority for the government, as we know, and for members of Parliament, as it is for our industry. As I have said just a moment ago, banks are an active and important part of the daily life of most Canadians. In fact, 96% of Canadians have an account with the financial institutions. That means that millions of people turn to our industry every day for financial advice. Banks go well beyond this and aim to be leaders of financial literacy activities in communities across the country. For our part, the CBA, we take this responsibility very seriously, and tomorrow we will be unveiling our new financial literacy program for seniors. This is a free, non-commercial, non-partisan program, and it's going to be presented to seniors groups by volunteer local bankers across the country. We want to offer tips and information to retirees or soon-to-be retirees about cash management. We want to offer tips and information about how to spot and avoid financial abuse.
1 minute.
And we want to prepare seniors to spot financial scams targeted at them. We'll be sending information on our program to all of your parliamentary offices shortly, and I would encourage you to review that material. We'd like your help, actually, in promoting these programs to seniors groups, as we have worked with you on our high school program, Your Money students. I would encourage you to get in touch with us. If you are interested, we'll gladly work with you. That very briefly is what we've recommended. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I look forward to your questions later on.
Thank you for your presentation. We'll now hear from Mr. Dancy, please.
Thank you. On behalf of Chartered Professional Accountants of Canada, thank you for the opportunity to appear before this committee today. Merci pour l'opportunité. October 1st was an historic day for the accounting profession with the unification of CPA Canada and CGA Canada under Chartered Professional Accountants of Canada. When unification of the profession in every province is complete, there will be over 190,000 chartered professional accountants in Canada. My remarks today will focus on the theme of improving Canada's taxation and regulatory regimes. I will also address other themes put forward by the committee, including balanced budgets, fiscal sustainability, increased competitiveness and economic growth, and why this focus will benefit Canada and sustain prosperity for all Canadians. First, strong management of finances is critical. We support the federal government's goal to return to balanced budgets through restraining annual government spending rather than increasing the overall tax burden. Second, taxes. We acknowledge the government has introduced measures to lower taxes and made improvements to ease the compliance burden. However, more can be done. There has not been a thorough review of Canada's tax system since the Royal Commission on Taxation in 1966. It's time for tax reform. In the past, this committee endorsed our recommendation that the federal government undertake a comprehensive review of Canada's tax system to reduce its complexities and inefficiencies. We ask the committee to again support this recommendation. We also recommend that the government appoint an independent expert panel to provide advice on options to streamline the tax system. And, in addition, consider creating a permanent independent tax simplification office, as in the UK, to review existing and proposed measures. Tax reform would improve Canada's international competitiveness, productivity, economic growth, and long-term prosperity. Third, turning to Canada's regulatory regime, we know that red tape places an undue burden on business and stifles competition and growth. We believe that through the Red Tape Reduction Action Plan and annual scorecard, the government is off to a good start, but it can go further. We have raised a number of suggestions, including modifications to the T1135 foreign reporting form and the withholding requirements under Regulations 102 and 105. We also recommend that standardized business reporting, namely XBRL, be adopted for use by businesses for all government filings. This would reduce the compliance costs for business and would improve the government's data collection, resulting in cost savings. We were pleased that standardized business reporting was included in your recommendations both in 2012 and 2013. Fourth, we are also encouraged by the government's commitment to financial literacy. Helping Canadians develop financial knowledge is critical to individual and societal economic prosperity and growth. Indeed, financial literacy is all the more relevant in view of the level of household debt. CPA Canada is an active participant in strengthening financial literacy through publications on money management, surveys and studies, education campaigns, and volunteer outreach initiatives in communities across Canada. We were very pleased to see Minister Oliver partner with us on one of these outreach initiatives last month and encourage other members to follow suit. This is not a partisan issue. Fifth, trade. Canada's prosperity is closely linked to economic opportunities beyond our borders. Canada's small and medium-sized enterprises play a vital role in boosting economic growth and diversifying Canada's export markets. CPA Canada supports efforts to negotiate trade agreements that eliminate barriers to the free movement of goods, services, capital, and labor, both internationally and within our country. Sixth, R&D. We remain committed to initiatives that can improve productivity and spur opportunities, such as the Patent Box, which rewards innovative companies through a lower rate on profits earned through the exploitation of patents in Canada. Our R&D focus needs to be not only on incenting scientific research in Canada, but also encouraging businesses to commercialize and retain patents in Canada. A Patent Box regime will do that. Finally, skilled professionals are vital to Canada's economic future. We appreciate the government's initiatives to quickly integrate internationally trained professionals into Canadian labour markets, initiatives where CPA Canada is working closely with both ESDC and CICA. We look forward to working with you to promote long-term economic growth. Nous vous remercions de votre attention.
Okay, thank you very much. We'll now go to Mr. Baker, please.
Thank you. Good afternoon. It's an honor and privilege to be here today to address this committee and to provide some input on behalf of Deloitte regarding Budget 2015 for your consideration. Budget 2015 will provide the government the opportunity to continue its commitment to improving economic prosperity for Canadians. Canada has maintained relative stability despite the global economic challenges of the past number of years. We strongly support and applaud the government's focus on achieving and maintaining a balanced budget. We also applaud the approach that Canada has taken in recent years of reducing Canada's corporate tax rate to improve its competitiveness relative to other countries. Specific topic that I'll be addressing today is around improving Canada's taxation and regulatory regimes. I will highlight the issues that we raised in our August 2014 submission to this committee on this topic, which was supplemented by a prior submission that we did on May 9, 2014 to the Department of Finance. Canada, along with pretty much the rest of the world, is concerned with protecting its tax base. Tax revenue is needed in order to maintain the standard of living that Canadians enjoy, while actualizing core Canadian values of quality education, health care, human dignity, to name but a few. Thus, Canada has taken some unilateral steps to protect the tax base and has also been participating in the OECD's Base Erosion and Profit Shifting (BEPS) initiative. However, taxation alone is not the only element to ensure a well-supported Canadian society. Canada's competitiveness in terms of attracting inbound investment must also be protected. We are concerned that the anti-treaty shopping proposals contained in the 2014 budget will, if enacted in their current form, hurt Canada's ability to attract such investment by being too far-reaching and creating significant uncertainty as to the tax consequences of inbound investment. As such, foreign investors may choose to invest elsewhere. Since the announcement of the treaty shopping proposals, we have observed that uncertainty has negatively affected the investment decisions and may discourage inbound investment into Canada. Canada is a relatively small, open economy that needs capital well beyond that which Canadian residents can provide. Foreign investors have a broad range of opportunities as to where they will invest their capital. Thus, introducing Canadian tax policy changes, such as the anti-treaty shopping proposals that create uncertainty and potentially reduce investment yields, will undermine Canada's foreign inbound investment into Canada. To attract foreign capital, Canadian projects generally must support higher potential yields than comparative investments located in the home jurisdiction where the capital is. The U.S. is one of those sources of capital. This is a particular issue for the energy and resources sector, given the sector's significant need and difficulty in accessing capital. In our detailed submission, our detailed comments and recommendations are outlined in our May 9, 2014 submission to the Department of Finance, which accompanied our submission to this committee. We're encouraged by the fact that the Department of Finance announced at the end of August that it was not proceeding at that time with releasing detailed draft legislation regarding the anti-treaty shopping proposal. Rather, it would await further work by the OECD in this area as part of the BEPS initiative. On the topic of BEPS, the goals of the BEPS initiative, which is supported by the G20, include curtailing international tax planning that is perceived to be inappropriate and increasing its transparency. We are supportive of Canada's participation in this international initiative. The Canadian tax base must be preserved. However, we would offer some specific suggestions. Clearly drafted, specific and targeted provisions are preferable to broadly worded legislative amendments that are subject to interpretation and thereby increase uncertainty. Canada must continue to encourage growth. We cannot afford to remove all tax features that might be perceived by some countries as challenging to those countries' tax bases. While international cooperation is important, it cannot be at the expense of our own country's competitiveness. A balance must be struck. In the context of the BEPS initiative, as well as domestic context, we would recommend that actions which could adversely impact competitiveness should not be undertaken unless Canada's trading partners are in fact implementing corresponding changes at the same time. Thank you very much for the opportunity to make these comments.
Okay, thank you very much for your presentation. We'll now go to Mr. Parker, please.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to present here today. The Investment Industry Association was encouraged to put forward a member to discuss the challenges and opportunities facing the investment climate and our industry today. I appreciate that opportunity to join you here from Calgary. I'm the president of a small investment dealer that finances businesses from a variety of industries, and the primary challenge we face in the post-2008-2009 investment climate is a reduction in access to capital for smaller Canadian businesses. There's a variety of reasons for this, from demographics to a risk aversion on the back of that financial crisis. Our industry association has seen a reduction of 25 boutique investment dealers through mergers or just ceasing business, and most of these dealers were focused on financing the smaller businesses. So the IAC has been a proponent of a capital gains rollover to encourage investment, and there are investors that would be highly likely to be encouraged to put more money to work in smaller businesses. So I've included a PowerPoint presentation just to give you a bit of a sense of what it is we do. We're a bit of a smaller dealer, and we use public disclosure, financial statements to identify good companies and to finance them. So our view is any inducement to encourage more public company investment increases the pool of potential opportunities for us to take to the next level, and that translates to more jobs. So, I touched earlier on investors are increasingly more risk-averse, focusing on bonds, dividend-paying stocks, and cash, and avoiding the riskier and smaller speculative companies. And these are the businesses that produce many of the jobs in our country. So I also included, for illustrative purposes, 3 businesses where access to capital is not a problem, just to give you a sense of how our business works. They are Alaris, Black Diamond, and Stella Jones. I won't walk through each one of them, but basically the story is the same. At a stage somewhere around 100 million market capitalization, a dealer such as ourselves starts to get interested, starts to trade in the shares, starts to introduce it to institutional and retail investors. And what you see post that is a number of other brokerage firms get involved. But the point that's telling is below that level, there's very few institution or large retail investors that are prepared to finance these businesses. Technical problems? Sorry.
Yeah, Mr. Parker, back up a little bit. I think we're getting some feedback on the mic. So.
Okay, sorry. So how do we finance these companies? I touched on that. We have retail brokers who talk to their clients, institutional investors, and if we're not prepared to finance a company, there's very few dealers in the country that will, as we're one of the smallest brokerage firms out there. So that highlights the gap that we see as existing is generally below 100 million market capitalization. And that concludes my remarks. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation. Colleagues, we'll begin again with Mr. Cullen, and we'll start with 7-minute rounds. We'll go as long as we can for those.
Thank you to all of our witnesses. I'll keep the questions short, and we'll try to get through a number of them. First of all, Mr. Campbell, thank you very much for your opening comments. It means a lot. These were rooms in which this room in particular, my colleagues occupied, and us across the hall, and the impacts of last week have an effect on all of us. So thank you. A question that you didn't touch on, but one I want to get to and then connect over to some of the other testimony that we heard, is the tax regulatory burden on Canadian companies and individuals a concern for the CBA as it stands right now? The cost of submitting and complying with the tax regulations as they exist in Canada, both for companies and for individuals.
Probably my colleagues will be in a better position to address that. We tend to focus on the overall architecture, but I do hear a lot. I do hear a lot about the administrative complexity as an issue. If you follow, for instance, the small business community publications, the CFIB, and you look at the top constraints to growth and to business, regulatory red tape, tax issues, and that sort of thing are often high up there. So I do hear that, but I have to tell you, Mr. Cullen, I'm not really an expert in that. Okay?
So and I'm going to come to Mr. Dancy in just a second. Let me ask, we'll see how uncomfortable the question is. I'll let you judge. The issue of pay-to-pay was raised in the throne speech last year and the year prior. It sounds now that telecommunications companies that are submitting their bills to Canadians will not be under the new proposed laws. This is something, of course, New Democrats have advocated for. Banks are now on a voluntary system, not mandatory as the telecommunications companies are. How is your association rationalizing, justifying that?
Well, I think we deal with that by pointing out that banks do not and have not charged for issuing bills or credit card bills or statements that show a balance owing. We haven't done that. We have entered into, given that it was a current issue, we have cemented that practice in a commitment, which is overseen, by the way, by the federal government's Financial Consumer Agency of Canada. Any commitment we enter into, they are overseen and they report on progress. So that comes into effect.
So just to summarize, you don't charge it right now, and your commitment is to not charge it consumers to receive their
For
bills.
the bills, that's right. And the FCAC will oversee.
Mr. Dancy, to you, let's talk about trends in terms of complexity of the tax system in Canada. And I want to combine the two, both personal and corporate taxes, in those two systems, which I know are different but have some overlap. Are we trending towards a more complicated tax system and higher regulatory burdens, or are we trending towards a more simplified tax code?
Well, I've been around the tax game a long time. I was the leader of a tax practice of a large firm. In one of my prior lives, I was ADM tax policy in the Department of Finance, so I came in front of this committee many times. It's really hard to actually peg, is it getting worse or better? It's still complicated. It always was complicated.
Excuse me, just to be clear on my question, it wasn't about worse or better.
Yeah.
Are we trending towards more complexity or towards more simplicity?
Yeah, and that's what I was just turning the words around in terms that more complex would be worse. In some respects, there have been some good things that have happened. I think the reduction in terms of the corporate rates, the attempts to broaden the base, anything that reduces rates and broadens the base is a good philosophical thing to do in terms of taxes. Having said that, the system still is complex. And the regulatory burden in terms of the compliance burden is still high.
So to quote, as Mr. Campbell mentioned, CFIB and others, who the government likes to quote a lot, pegs it somewhere on last year's tax burden, regulatory tax burden, somewhere around $10 billion to consumers and $31 billion to to businesses of all size in Canada. I wonder, as the government has moved towards what might be seen as more politically favorable taxation system, these one-off, what are sometimes called boutique tax credits, how is it we're not moving towards a more complex system? First. Second, and I've heard from your members, this is why I'm a little bit confused by the answer, that there has been a long-standing desire and concern that the regulatory burden is increasing. And this is from the CFIB, it's from the Chartered Accountants in Canada, and that it's only getting worse in terms of complexity, never mind the specific policies. Your view is that you almost painted a picture that it was neutral, that it's always been complex and it's complex still.
Well, I think the red tape reduction panel has had some good successes, but as you said, more could be done. For example, just that comment on Regulation 102 and 105. I was vice chair of a panel on what Canada's international tax policy should be in 2008. We recommended changes to that to those regulations back in 2008. The American Chamber of Commerce has made the same recommendations since that time, and we still don't have changes to that particular regulation. So
you may have said it. Are we due for another Carter? Is it? I mean, 66 through 69 is the last time we properly looked at the tax code.
Right, and the world has changed a lot since.
You think?
Because income is a lot more mobile than it was then, and so it is a different world today than it was in '66. So that the principles that Carter applied to tax reform may not actually be the right ones today. And I think we need to sit back and have a good look in terms of what tax reform should be going forward.
Thank you, Mr. Dancy. Quickly over to you, Mr. Baker. Does Deloitte have any position or opinion on the so-called patent box approach to invigorating investment in research and development in Canada?
We think it should be explored. That a number of countries in Europe and elsewhere have that type of regime. As part of the BEPS project that was mentioned earlier, that is, the patent boxes are in the process of being looked at. There are different types of regimes in different countries, and the BEPS committees are still debating as to exactly what type of regime are the ones that they would recommend moving forward with. But there is no question that the patent boxes as an entity will survive, and so from our perspective, it is something that the federal government should be seriously considering, given that it is potentially giving those countries a competitive advantage.
Just very briefly, are you aware of any exploration by the federal government towards this initiative right now?
I'm not aware of exploration.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Cullen. Go to Mr. Keddy. Maybe we'll have a Keddy Commission.
Motion.
You want a motion on
We don't have time.
We're going to need a motion, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome to our witnesses. I've got several questions for Mr. Kirby, and I listened to your submission, and I've tried to do a bit of background on you, but I really have some difficulty in what you're saying about how the charitable tax system and the audit system works. And I think it's important to get on the record. So I've got some questions. When you audited, or when you did your master's theses on 16 charitable organizations who you're saying have been audited too strenuously by CRA, did you speak to CRA? Did you speak to any of CRA employees? Did you speak to the commissioner or the deputy commissioner?
I attempted to get some information from that, but there's a lot of, CRA has a lot of what it has on its website, a lot of its policies and its approach as it's stated. I spoke to 16 charity leaders and 5 charity experts, and they, only 8 of them were being audited or had similar experiences with CRA.
I tell you, one of the shocks actually that I had when as a member of Parliament when I first got elected is how much work we do with CRA. We all do a lot of work, but I've never met anyone, whether they were actually correct in being angry with CRA for being audited, or if they were incorrect, who was happy about the process. No one really likes to be audited. So, but I really do have a question with your process. Like to begin with, as a member of Parliament, to come here with an anonymous statement of fact is not a statement of fact. Either you got a name and a place with it, or don't, please don't present it as fact. And you know, the Charities Directed Alone is not subject to political direction. It's not subject from this government. I don't believe it's subject from a previous government. I don't think it'll be subject from a future government. I think you have to give some credit to these professional men and women. We may not like the process, but and I just have to ask you this: from your own numbers, you state that less than 3% of most charities, less than 3% of their time is with political activity. Well, they're allowed 10%. So if they are audited and they're spending less than 10%, then they're whole, and that should justify their right. That's a selling point for them. I mean, that's not a negative thing. So,
is there a question in that, sir?
Yeah, the question is, like, how can you say that somehow or another these organizations should be not open to audit? There are $14.24 billion in charitable money given by Canadians every single year. And are you suggesting we shouldn't audit any of those dollars?
I'm glad you asked that. No, that's not what I'm suggesting at all. What I found from talking to the charities is to a person, I think the leaders emphasized that they understand the need for audits. Many of the organizations have been through multiple audits in the past. The difference is that starting in 2012, there was additional money resourced to CRA to hire additional auditors and to specifically audit political activities when there's no evidence that there was a problem with political activities. Obviously, it's really important that the regulations be followed by charities, and that money be well used.
But surely you don't think you should be able to spend more than 10% of your assets on political activity. I mean, either you're a charity or you're a political organization. I mean, somehow or another, we have to find some common ground here. And again, an anonymous source, I have to tell you, is not a source. I can give you a dozen anonymous sources. So I have another question. Energy Probe Research Foundation, article in the Globe and Mail last week, very interesting article. A charitable organization. Did you speak to them? They've been audited, and they would be called a right-wing think tank, but they deny that. But they've been audited They claim they're the most audited group in Canadian history because of their position on atomic energy. They're audited by the Liberal government. They've been audited by our government. So did you look for somebody that had a different opinion so you could have some balance in what you're saying?
I audited from 5 different sectors in 5 different provinces, sir, and absolutely, I won't say who I audited. Part of my ethics process was that I not say that. The agreement with the charity leaders is that I wouldn't identify them or say anything that would lead directly back to them. And it's I think, very interesting that so many of them felt a need to have that level of anonymity with something that's this public.
1 minute.
Okay, and I'll try to wrap this up. And I'll leave the anonymity alone. It really doesn't wash.
I'd like to address that anonymity,
quite
actually.
frankly.
Sure.
But you talk about $13.4 million invested into looking for tax evasion in the charitable sector. However, that's a small amount of money. That's a pittance compared to the $14.24 billion and the 86,000 charities that are out there in Canada. And what I'm saying, I want to be very clear, is that government has an obligation to make sure that charitable dollars donated for charitable purposes are used for charitable purposes. And it's as simple as that.
Absolutely, and I don't think it's hard to imagine that anybody would disagree with that. You keep referring to the value of the sector, and which is a financial question. These are not financial audits against her. They're political activity audits, which are...
They're financial audits based on the fact you're only allowed to spend 10% of your funds on political
All right, thank
activity.
you. Thank you. Fortunately, the time is up. Thank you, Mr. Keddy. Go to Mr. Chan for 7 minutes.
Gentlemen, thank you so much for all of your presentations. I actually want to follow up on Mr. Keddy's point and continue the conversation with Mr. Kirkby, and thank you very much for your presentation. In terms of your research, was there any sort of evidence that you saw that this special audit program to investigate the activities of charities targeted specifically the political activities of charities that were focused, that were immediately critical of current government policy, or was it spread all over the map? Was it particularly charities that you might view as being more opposed to the government as opposed to in favor of government policy? Do you have any sort of statistical evidence out there as opposed to giving away who you actually spoke to that would give us some comfort with respect to the position you're advocating?
I found that 3 major sectors were being audited. Environmental organizations that work on energy issues, particularly around the oil sands and pipelines and export off the coast. Secondly, international development and human rights organizations. And the third were charities that had significant labor union funding. I think it's fair to say that all 3 of those organizations, those categories, probably have, with this current government, they would tend to have higher political activity levels than some other. Because in participating in public conversations, they may be more critical of the current government. They have often a different approach than the current government is taking on the issues.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Kirby. I want to turn my questions to Mr. Campbell and I guess indirectly to Mr. Parker. Both of your organizations your members are voluntarily contribute to the Ombudsman for Banking and Investment Services. Of course, it's a voluntary participation in this under OBC that provides oversight, or not oversight, that provides a service that essentially seeks to resolve disputes between your member organizations and the broader public. And that follows really from your comments with respect to financial literacy. I am curious, given that a number, particularly Mr. Campbell, a number of your members, at least 2 of the chartered banks have withdrawn their financial support to OBC. Do you think it might now be high time that they be subject to mandatory regulation or mandatory oversight by the Ministry of Finance?
Well, let me actually set the record straight just a little bit. We are members of the Ombudsman system. Actually, in fact, the banking industry created the Ombudsman system. All Canadian banking customers have access to consumer redress through the Ombudsman system. Some go through OBC, some go through ADR chambers. What the government has done, the federal government has done, is actually put a requirement in the Bank Act that says all banks must be members of an approved ombudsman agency. And the approval process, again, runs through the federal government's Financial Consumer Agency of Canada. Applications have to be made to the FCAC, demonstrating their processes, their strengths, their capabilities in terms of running an ombudsman system. And then the government, and then the agency, I guess to the advice of the government or to the minister, will recommend and approve those bodies that meet government standards. So it is in fact a requirement. There's a process underway right now that the two existing bodies out there, and potentially others, I'm not privy to that, have put in their applications and they're being considered now. So this is subject to government standards. All financial institutions, all my members, will have to be members of a accredited, registered ombudsman through the government's requirements.
My only quick follow-up question is where there isn't ultimate financial support for OBC, doesn't that ultimately undermine the financial capacity to have an effective ombudsman that isn't properly financially resourced?
In fact, I think if you look at OBC's track record, particularly over the last few years, you will have seen a significant strengthening and improvement in terms of their responsiveness, their timeliness, the quality of their responses, their turnaround time, all of that sort of stuff. They have a very strong chair, very strong board, and in fact, I think you find that under over the last few years, there has been an elevation of how they're performing. And as I say, this will all be done under government standards and approved, and I think we can all take comfort at that.
Quick question for Mr. Dancy. In the 2012 budget, federal budget, the SHRED program of $1.3 billion was subject to cuts, and the general rate was reduced from 20 to 15%, and excluded capital expenses from the program, and also reduced the eligibility of contract payments from 100 to 80%. What are your thoughts on that, on these particular cuts, and what impact do you think this will ultimately have on Canadian competitiveness?
Okay, there's about 1 minute remaining, please. There's about 1 minute remaining.
Okay, several points. One is in terms of, we're not sure all those cutbacks should be made, for example, particularly the exclusion of capital expenditures. Albert may have some comments on that as well. I think I'd also like to come back to the patent box concept, because the SHRED program, the way it is now, it incents the carrying on of scientific research, which is a very important thing to do. But I think what we also have to do in Canada is to incent the commercialization of that research in Canada and the retention of those patents in Canada. And that's what the program does not do right now, and that's what a patent box would do. So I think the program has to do with both aspects, not only incenting scientific research, basic foundational research, but also the commercialization of that research.
Very quick follow-up point. Would you favor the instrument of tax policy over grants? Which is interesting because supposedly the point of this particular reduction was to redirect funds towards a granting program.
Okay, brief question, brief answer.
My own personal view, I'm not sure the Institute has a view, but my own personal view is I have always favored tax policy to incent those things, that the marketplace will do it, as opposed to government trying to pick winners versus losers.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chan. We'll go to Mr. Allen, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for being here. I'd like to focus my question to Mr. Dancy and Mr. Baker. And I'm going to pick up on the patent box one to start with, and then I want to talk a little bit about tax simplification, and then I want to talk about some of the red tape reduction. In the patent box, and I get the idea with respect to what you're trying to do there, and the importance of the innovation and the R&D and those types of things. Can you talk a little bit about how successful that's been in other countries? And I mean specifically with respect to what it's contributed to GDP. Do we have any numbers on that? And do you have any numbers on the increase in patents or companies staying within the country, for example, under a patent box theory?
I will start, maybe Albert can follow. I don't have particular stats at my fingertips on either of those things. I think what I could say, though, is that the first patent box, I believe, was in Ireland probably about 20 or 30 years ago, and it has been replicated in a number of European countries since that time. The latest I'm aware of is the UK just in the last year or two. And I think sometimes imitation is the best form of flattery you can get, and is good evidence that it must be working. Otherwise, why would a whole bunch of other countries not be doing it? And they are doing it. So I think that's a very key fact.
I agree with that, Kevin. The evidence that's out there, there aren't a lot of academic studies that are out there. A number of these regimes are relatively new, but as Kevin says, they're out there. They're certainly providing competition for Canada. Anecdotally, there's evidence that's out there that's supportive of it. There's particular companies that have come out and given evidence to those countries, made statements around the fact that they've either stayed in that particular country or moved and carried out more operations in a particular country that had a patent box. But I would say the academic evidence isn't there yet in terms of the resulting benefits to GDP. But anecdotally, there is evidence that these are working in other jurisdictions.
It strikes me that on this, using the patent box theory, and I'll just come at it, for the first question is, what types of companies are asking for this, and are they? And it strikes me that maybe it would favor larger companies as opposed to smaller, and I'll tell you why. If a smaller company's making a product and they're doing something in their business, for example, and let's say they have a patent that they're going to do on their process which helps them make a whole bunch of products, then how do you attribute that to a specific thing? I can understand if you have a new product that you're selling, makes sense, and you could actually put that in a box. But if you're talking about someone who's doing something, a patent on a process which improves all their products, how do you do that?
Yeah, the regimes are all different, and so exactly how that works in each regime, I wouldn't be able to say. But in principle, in terms of large versus small, I would see it the other way. That in terms of having a patent box, some of the regimes that we talk about the BEPS project, and some of these structures are being looked at. But larger multinationals around the world oftentimes have other alternatives available to them through international structuring of being able to enjoy lower tax rates on certain types of income around commercialization, which smaller companies don't have access to. One of the ideas behind the patent box is that it's simpler than having and less expensive to implement than having those types of regimes in place. And so while those international structures tend to be more for the larger companies, a patent box, I think, in principle, could be designed such that it would have application to both large and small.
Okay.
Yeah, just a follow-up on that is that it's pretty clear, certainly given my history in tax over 30 years, that countries around the world use corporate tax policy as a competition vehicle. They use it to attract investment. And that's just the reality of the world. So my perspective would be, why shouldn't Canada want to attract that type of investment here and have that type of, the retention of that and the commercialization of that intellectual property here? Because that would be good for this country to do.
Now, you led me right into the next question is, one of the things I see absent or did not see in your submission, which we've heard a lot from companies and in some of the briefs we're hearing today, is the commitment to a long-term commitment to the accelerated capital cost allowance, which is, again, a measure that we say that we are not competitive against the U.S., for example, in that, and some have suggested a rate of 45%. Is there a reason that has not been in your submissions?
It actually is in our submission. I didn't talk about it in our comments today, but the whole issue of making sure that our capital cost allowance system kind of reflects the economic life of the assets and is competitive is one of the aspects that's actually in our written submission. To meet the 5-minute time limit, had to cut certain things.
I know how that happens.
It's not one that we focused on in particular.
Okay, okay. I want to ask a question about tax simplification, and one of Mr. Cofield, who was here last week at committee, when I asked him the question with respect to, is there an example of a country that has been able to make significant steps to tax simplification and a process whereby they get there? And while some countries have done things, the UK has made some measures, and we've done a few things. Do you know of any countries who have actually made great strides in a process for tax simplification, and you could see them actually getting to a simplified tax code from where we are today?
You want to take that first? As the global head of Deloitte?
Yeah, I wouldn't be able to identify any particular success stories offhand. Certainly it is an initiative, it's a goal. Something I would add, though, is that given the complexity of just carrying on business today, that there's two issues. One is getting the tax policy right, and the other is tax administration. And if sometimes, unfortunately, getting the policy right does require introducing some complexity. So tax simplification, is good overall, but if it's a choice between getting the policy right and getting simplification, I'll vote for the policy.
Just a few seconds left if you wanted to answer as well, Mr. Dancy.
I would just add that the whole issue of kind of simplicity and tax policy and tax administration is always a journey. You never reach the goal. And I think that's just the reality.
It's a very philosophical answer, Mr. Dancy. Thank you.
That's the pragmatic reality. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't, keep on working at it.
Thank you, Mr. Dancy. Mr. Allen, we'll go to Mr. Rankin for up to 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to all of the witnesses today. Excellent presentations. I'd like to start with Mr. Kirkby, if I could, and thank you very much for your excellent research. I mean, it's a very thorough reporting. It's 75 pages of dense reasoning, and I really appreciate what you've done in basically elucidating this problem that we've heard so much about in this committee. I'm just trying to figure out what the solutions are. If there are problems, what are they? I mean, you talk about a lack of clear definitions in the regulations. You talk about the CRA website being naive and unhelpful, according to some of the people that you talked about. Are those the key suggestions you're making, aside from just not even having this program because there's nothing to really warrant this kind of $13 million expenditure? Is that your thrust of what you're saying?
On that first one, back to the pre-2012 program, which had a dimension of auditing for political activities, but it was mainly a random or an issue came forward, and they addressed it. I think another one is the purposes. There's a need to look at purposes. Canada has 3 charitable purposes. The UK, we followed the UK in our legislation, and now they have 13. And they also spun off the charity directorate there from the tax authority. We're falling behind the whole Commonwealth on this, actually, and so I would point to that. And I would note that one that is just coughing up the evaluation grid that CRA uses. Charities could use something really practical that they could evaluate themselves from. And what's more practical than the grid that is actually used by the auditor to understand what it is that is expected of you?
Good, thank you. My next question is for Mr. Baker of Deloitte. So a couple of questions, actually. It sounds like you said that the BEPS OECD work that's underway, we shouldn't proceed in efforts to protect our tax base unless and until we're doing so in conjunction with our other trading partners. I assume that if we were to do so in conjunction, you would support the OECD BEPS initiative or not?
Yeah, no, we were supportive of the initiative. What we're suggesting is that people need to act at the same time. We wouldn't want to see Canada taking steps sooner.
Stand up, but assuming that we did, then you would be in favor of proceeding along the lines of the recommendation. Of course, subject to what they finally look like, those recommendations, but generally you would be, if we do so in conjunction, you'd support going ahead.
Yes.
Okay. And the other question you alluded to was the tax treaty shopping, and you were concerned that the initiative might actually hurt us with respect to inbound investments. Maybe already is hurting us. Could you speak a little bit more about that?
So in terms of treaty shopping, there was a proposal put forward in the last budget that was, in our view, going to create, in terms of the way that it was described in the budget documents, create a lot of uncertainty as to whether or not a Canadian company could access the treaty with the other country. And where that treaty cannot be accessed, there's a 25% withholding tax that applies on interest, on dividends and royalty payments coming out of Canada. And so our concern is that, and so today, there is far less certainty. So a company coming into Canada or a pooled investment coming into Canada can rely on the treaty that's there and the Canadian laws that are there. Our concern is having this overlay that was proposed in the manner that it was proposed was going to create undue certainty. Undue uncertainty.
Yes. All right. Mr. Parker, I want to make sure your presentation was excellent on behalf of Acumen Capital Partners, and basically you left us hanging. You said we've got this real problem with small cap investors, not finding the capital. 100 million seemed to be the threshold of market cap, and then under that there is a real problem. And you talked about how there'd been a consolidation in the investment industries of Canada. These are very, very disturbing comments. So if you have any recommendations, I'd love to hear.
Yeah, there's a number of them. I think in general we're in favor of supporting investing in these companies, and one of the proposals is a capital gains rollover, which would allow you to take investment dollars out of a sold investment as long as you put it to work within 6 months, and that would enhance the investment capital that's available. And we talk to a lot of investors, both retail and institutional, and I think if you talk to most institutional investors, they'd say they invest they're indifferent to taxation. They just want to make the rational decision. But if you talk to a retail investor, there's many with pregnant capital gains in large positions where they're just unwilling to sell because of the capital gains it'll trigger. So if you encourage them to sell and reallocate the capital to growth businesses, my view would be it would encourage more jobs.
Chair? Okay, thank you for that. I'd like to go now to Mr. Dancy of the CPA Canada. In your written material, you talk about the fact we haven't had a Royal Commission since Carter to address the improvements to the Canadian tax and regulatory system. And you talk about the need for tax reform. Is your organization taking the position that we need a Carter II?
Well, we need tax reform, whether it's called Carter II or not. We can, kind of debate that issue. But I think it is time to have a good step back to look at the whole tax system, the consumption tax system, corporate system, personal tax system. See if we got the balance right, and see, frankly, is the tax system fit for purpose in today's economy? Because the world has changed a lot, as I said. Income is a lot more mobile.
Again, to specifics, you talk about maintaining competitive corporate tax rates by continuing to benchmark Canada's rates against the OECD average. I'm not sure what you mean by benchmarking. I believe we have the lowest corporate capital tax amongst OECD countries. So are you saying we benchmark to the average, or what do you mean?
Just a brief response, please.
No, we don't have the lowest corporate tax rate amongst all the OECD. We have on the marginally effective tax rate in terms of capital investment. We actually have become very competitive with our move to the GST, etc. But in terms of just our overall corporate rates, we are still middle of the pack when it comes to OECD rates.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. We'll go to Mr. Adler, please. For 7 minutes, Mr. Adler, yes.
Thank you very much, Chair. Welcome, everybody, for being here today, and thank you all. This has been a very fulsome discussion, and I would like to engage each and every one of you, but I've only got 7 minutes, so I'm going to pick and choose here. Let me start off with Mr. Kirkby. You've made some pretty serious allegations here today, and it seems like you're relying on some anecdotal evidence to support your allegations. Do you have anything more than that? Than anecdotal evidence?
I don't understand why you'd say that anecdotal evidence. I followed a process that's considered an excellent process in qualitative research. I went through all of the steps. I'm confused by your suggestion.
This is my time. If I may, you mentioned that there's political interference in CRA. I would just like to know, and I'm sure the committee would like to know, what evidence you have of that.
Sure. I have the evidence of what I heard from the leaders and the experts condensed, also looking at the literature.
Evidence is what you're...
Well, no, absolutely not anecdotal evidence.
Thank you.
It's based on people's experience.
I would... you mentioned also that the charities that you had spoken to, who had seemed to have problems with being audited, and I know Mr. Van Kester next to me, who runs a car dealership, has been audited a number of times, he's told me, and he's not in the charitable business, but I can guarantee you that. There's organizations like IRFAN and ISNA, IRFAN, which has been sending money to Hamas, and ISNA to a terrorist group in Pakistan. Are these the kind of expert charitable organizations that you were referring to and relying on for your evidence?
That's a very strange question, sir, I think.
Well,
I spoke to many of some of the charities I spoke to were amongst, I would say, many Canadians' favorite charities, small and large, in different sectors, in different provinces.
Okay, thank you. I have a quote here from the Commissioner and Deputy Commissioner of CRA, and he says, quote, "To be clear, the process for identifying which charities will be audited for any reason is handled by the Charities Directorate alone, and like all our audit activities is not subject to political direction," end of quote.
The government
thank you. That wasn't a question.
Oh, that wasn't. You don't want to.
Mr. Campbell.
You don't want to reply to that?
Okay. Order. So, Mr. Adler, is that a question, or do you?
That was. Well, you can choose to answer. I would be happy to be brief.
You've given $13.4 million now to CRA, told them to change their priorities on what they're auditing, hired a whole bunch of new people, specified go look at political activities. Some individual MPs.
You don't agree with that?
You created a funnel that pushed CRA into auditing certain charities.
Mr. Chair, it's my time, is it not?
Sir.
It is your time, but I think we should, if a question is asked, we should allow a witness to answer. So do you have a further question, or do you want to move on?
No, I'm moving on to Mr. Campbell.
Moving on? Okay.
Yes. Thank you.
Mr. Adler?
Mr. Campbell, Canadian banks have a reputation as being healthy and strong, comparatively speaking. Now, how strong are the Canadian banks right now compared to other global banks? I mean, we've seen, for example, Canadian banks are very efficient. They have excellent return on earnings, but the capital position of other banks around the world has improved drastically. Is this going to put competitive pressures on Canadian banks to change at all in their behavior? Can you address that?
Well, you're right that you're right on a number of fronts there, but you're right that the capital positions of banks around the world, which were found deficient, in 2007, 8, 9, they've had to raise their levels to the level of Canadian banks. But then, of course, everybody has had to move from that point on. But I draw your attention to the headlines of just a couple of days ago. I think 20-plus European banks failed their stress test, which is a stress test on capital. Canadian banks are consistently above what OSFI requires, consistently and materially above that. It's a very competitive world. The World Economic Forum has judged us the strongest bank, soundest bank 7 years running. I hope that will carry on, but what I would say, just to bring things to a focus, in my remarks I said we were always well capitalized. That's still true. We were always very well managed with a big focus on prudence. That has sure not changed. But we're also very well regulated. We have OSFI as a good supervisor, a strong supervisor. We've got a new leader there, and I think he's going to carry on with that tradition. So I don't see the fundamentals changing.
Now, there is downward pressure on the return on equity. Thanks. The regulatory environment, not just outside of Canada, is certainly changing. So the plates are shifting underneath the Canadian banks. We know where we stand today. Is there anything we need to do as a government to make sure that we maintain the position and the strength of Canadian banks on the global scene?
Okay, well, just a brief response.
Brief response. One of the strengths of our system is that the Bank Act is reviewed every 5 years. And that's coming up in 2017. And we would encourage that there be a good, thorough review of what is already a strong system, see what can be improved.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Adler. Before I go to Mr. Caron, can I ask just all the witnesses ensure you have your earpieces in and you're on translation if you require it? Okay. Okay. Mr. Caron, pour 7 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président, c'est bien apprécié.
Mr. Chairman, I will. Most of my questions will be for Mr. Parker because I'm very interested in the question of venture capital. The current situation in Canada, if we compare that to with the other OECD countries, how would you compare the situation for venture capital in Canada compared to what is happening in other OECD countries?
More specifically to Canada, because I'm a Canadian practitioner, but we certainly have a very unique system in Canada and a very historically a very robust market for capitalizing small businesses. And what's different here, and certainly than in the U.S., from what I have more direct experience, is we tend to finance companies publicly earlier than they would in the U.S. And for the last 20 years, it's been very robust, ups and downs to the cycles, but in the last 4 or 5 years, it's been a prolonged down cycle. We haven't seen the bounce back up. So, and I look at the U.S., and it's been more robust on their private equity side, which is the comparison. So I guess I look to Canada and say there just needs to be a bit of a priming of the pump to kickstart the animal spirits, get people back and investing in the earlier stage companies.
Leaders are very interested in the issue of venture capital. And I was looking at your brief, and it said last year the activities collapsed last year at almost historic levels, and capital used on the TSX dropped by 63%, starting from going to 3.8 billion, and in the same period, new registrations dropped by almost 2/3 to be there were 73 in 2013. That seems to be significant registrations and capital that has been raised. So these are quite impressive figures.
And we've seen a bit of a bounce back in 2014, but not to the levels we've seen before. And we have what is usually a very, very healthy market, and to lose 25 competitors normally is a good thing, right? But in my particular case, I look around the landscape and you see 25 competitors go away, and you say, is there a fundamental shift? And I believe there is.
Enfin, on a beaucoup débattu et vous avez probablement suivi les débats.
Probably followed the debates when the government announced the gradual decrease in venture capital by labor organizations, and not only the labor organizations, but also their partner. The Solidarity Fund of the QFL, for example, was pooling capital with investors and with private funds to invest in high technology in growth areas. The problem is that the government is gradually decreasing this credit for venture-sponsored capital funds. Do you think that the present government is going in the wrong direction from the direction that it should be taking to ensure that there is a healthy venture capital market?
Specific targeted investments to be propped up. It's more of a encourage a broader initiative would be more our view. So it's not necessarily the wrong direction. It's just we look at it's very hard for anyone, let alone government, to be able to say this is the one sector where we're going to be the best at in the world. So better to just to create an environment where all small companies have easier access to capital, and then some smart entrepreneur in a garage somewhere is going to come up with that great idea. So is it going to be in technology, or is it going to be in the oil field? We just don't know. So, to finally kind of pinpoint where you're going to drive policy, I think would be wrong-headed in our view.
I agree with you that the government shouldn't decide in which industry to invest. The funds will do that depending on their market decisions. However, the market itself, the venture capital market itself, is a very different market we've been talking about startup companies, and we've been talking about high-tech companies that need capital, but they can't necessarily provide the guarantees that investors are looking for. So if these labor-sponsored funds are reduced, and then they would perhaps be losing a great deal of money. So my question is, if the government currently has a strategy that is this really a solid strategy to promote the development of the growth of venture capital in Canada, and particularly the Israel and the United States are the leaders currently in this?
Specifically, to any initiative, there's going to be pros and cons. I would say, with regards to labor-sponsored funds, it wouldn't be. It's not that it's a bad thing. It just wouldn't be at the top of my list of initiatives to say how would you kickstart a broader investment in smaller businesses. You want to take away as many restrictions as possible, and I think the historical rate of return on some of the labor-sponsored funds have been imperfect. So, and I don't know that it would attract the capital necessarily that a broader initiative would. So it wouldn't be my favorite. I'm not to say it's bad, but my personal view wouldn't be the one I'd go after.
Okay. About 30 seconds.
Okay. Rapidement, j'ai posé la question.
I asked the question to the previous panel. The government it seems to be looking at a cooperative securities control model, and Alberta is not interested in participating, and so we might have two levels of regulation for securities. What would the impact of that be?
And asked me to come and speak on their behalf in pursuit of positive initiatives. Being in Alberta, my view it might not be the same as Ian Russell's in this particular topic, so I'm going to defer comment and allow Ian to answer the question.
I think we could probably read something into that. Well, thank you. Merci, Mr. Caron. We'll go to Mr. Van Kesteren, 7 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you all for coming. I think I'd better clear the air. As Mr. Adler mentioned my audits, I think I'm not going to direct this to Mr. Baker, too. Of course, an audit is something performed by the government. And we're not talking about businesses that bring their boxes in and the guy that's sticking half the money under the table. For most parts, most business, mine in particular, and I think that's the case with just about every business that would be reputable, goes through an accountant. And there's the difference between, we keep saying this, we need to hear it again and again, tax avoidance and tax evasion. I mean, tax avoidance is legal. I mean, if there's $50,000 worth of taxes to be paid, obviously it's within a citizen's right or an organization's right to reduce that in legitimate means. And sometimes the auditor comes down and says, oh, no, that's not what that means. We kind of, am I right in that assumption? Is that pretty much a fair?
Yeah, the rules are complex, and oftentimes there will be debate. There's gray areas in the law, and sometimes the auditor will have a view and the taxpayer will have a view. Ultimately, it's up to the courts to resolve those situations. All of that is fair game, and that falls within that. That tax avoidance, as you say, is legal, and it's the tax evasion that everyone agrees.
And auditors are put into the system to make sure everybody's following the rules. It's not like the government can chase an organization or chase. They can direct. The government can say, listen, I think you need to look at these guys here. You need to look at these. But in my line of work, and my line of work is here, but when I talk to my constituents, I hear it all the time. I got another an audit, and it's not fair, and we hear it repeatedly, but it is fair, and it's something the government has to continue doing. Is that a fair assessment?
Audits happen, and they always will.
Yeah, thank you. I want to talk to Mr. Campbell. And Mr. Campbell, you know I've been a big advocate of good, sound banking, and you, as a Canadian, your organization, bankings, has performed very well, and we're very proud of what's happened. But I'm also a big fan of credit unions, and would you agree that we need both strong banks and strong credit unions in this?
I would agree. And first of all, thank you very much, Mr. Van Kesteren, for your comment. I do appreciate that. We do need both. We need strong banks and we need strong credit unions. And on the latter, you know, I think the more choice and competition, the better it is for customers, the better it is for Canadians. You can choose, and you have options available to you. I would say, however, in terms of the interest of strengthening those competitors, one has to look at the nature of the regulatory system across this country that credit unions are under. One of the strengths of our system is that we have OSFI, world-class standards. And because credit unions are now at a provincial level, the quality of that regulation and supervision will vary. And some of those credit unions are getting very, very big. This is why the federal government put in place the option for a transitioning of some of these larger credit unions to this federal sphere so they can be under that quality of regulation under OSFI. None have done that yet, but the rules are still relatively new. So yes, strength on both sides, but we have to look at the quality of regulation.
Which leads me to the next question. They have asked for a capital growth tax credit. Now, they don't have the same access to funds that banks have. Would you be supportive of that ask as well as the banking?
I've discussed this with my counterpart at Credit Union Central quite a bit, and I will be very honest here. I am not a tax expert. I cannot really get into the ins and outs of whether that particular ask makes sense or not. I have a sense that the Department of Finance felt that it was an anomaly, a long-standing anomaly, and it had to be addressed. What I would say as a general principle, when you are competing for the customer's dollar, you're right, they don't have the access to the same degree of funds, but they do have themselves structured differently. There are, I think, legitimate tax breaks for credit unions. You do have to ask yourself, is what we're doing for the good of the customer, or are we introducing anomalies into the system that may look good now but will come back to bite us at some future date? So specifically, I would hesitate to say yay or nay on that specific initiative.
Well, that's fair. That's fair. Tell me just very quickly, Mr. Chair, how much time do I have left?
You've got just under 2 minutes.
Okay, so I'm going to just give you another quick question. Would Canadians be on the hook for banks that fail, like the customers in Cyprus? What's it called, a buy-in or something?
Bailout. Bail-in, actually. Bail-in.
Do we have any laws that would make that happen in this country?
That just is not a scenario that could happen in Canada, quite frankly. In fact, what has happened is there was a lot of confusion when Cyprus happened because bail-in was a new concept. The Federal Department of Finance has put out a paper on bail-in, which makes it very, very clear that no depositors, no taxpayers would have to step up in the extremely unlikely case that a Canadian bank would fail. Debt would be bailed in as capital.
I'm sure a lot of Canadians would like to hear that. And then I want to talk about invest industries. I want to go to your number one proposal. How much money do you feel is locked in, and what would that result in, do you feel, as far as if we release this capital?
Right. You know, it's anecdotal and it's hard to give you hard facts. It's just, you know, when I was asked to come down here, I talked to a number of colleagues in the industry and said, you know, this is the proposal the investment industry is putting forward. You know, what are your clients saying? And when I talked to a retail broker and he says, you know, I've got clients sitting on $1 million capital gain in this stock, he should sell it. But he doesn't want it because he doesn't want to pay the tax. So, like, you have enough of these conversations. I don't know what, to answer your question, I don't know what the number is, but it's a big number.
Okay, and just to be clear, we're talking about investments that are locked in, so people
They
don't want to pay the taxes.
They don't want to sell. Maybe they should sell, maybe they know they should sell, but there'll be a big tax gain, tax paid if they do.
As to how much money.
I don't have the number.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. If you want to provide that, or if you have any further information, you can always provide it to the committee.
Okay.
Thank you. The last round, Mr. Leong, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the panel members. I've, in prior to entering politics, I worked in many parts of the world and have also looked at corporations both in the public sector as well as the public corporations versus private corporations that have fared very well internationally. And returning back to Canada, it appears to me that we are in a very over-regulated regime, and so over-regulated to the point that we almost have to hire full-time accountants and lawyers for tax compliance and for regulatory compliances. So I just want to drill down a little bit on simplification of our system where we could be internationally competitive for attracting international investment dollars. And some of these may have to be, if I could sort of conjecture, have to do with standardizing reporting. Rather than having our reporting so complex that our financial accounting and our tax accounting has to be reconciled, and if there's some way that could be done. This has to do with sort of the philosophy of taxation. In one country I worked in, they had uniform invoices. There's no way that you can create an invoice or whatever. You always have a uniform invoice so that the tax department knows exactly what is the expense and what is the revenue at all times. And then for certain businesses, I think, whether it's depending on the business sector, we achieve a better efficiency by going back to the cash base of accounting rather than the accrual base of accounting. And I certainly share with you that we've come a long way since the 1966 Carter Commission and then the 1972 Tax Act when it was implemented, and at which time I did started my public accounting career. But as we move forward 40 years from now and looking back, I think we need to rethink some of that, and as you suggested. So I'd like to hear your comments on, start with Mr. Dancy first, on those 4 issues that I've touched upon.
Sure. Let me give you a couple of top-side observations. One in terms of, you talked a lot about, you worked around the world, saw businesses around the world when you came back to Canada. You saw that the regime was complicated in Canada in terms of a business operating in Canada that wants to operate around the world. So one thing in terms of the tax side on that is I would refer you back to the International Tax Panel that was created by the Department of Finance in 2008. Peter Godsoe, former chair of Bank of Nova Scotia, was the chair of that group, and I was the vice chair of the group. And that panel had a lot of recommendations that we believe would have led to a simpler regime for the operation of entities in Canada that wanted to operate around the world. Some of those recommendations have been implemented, a number of them have not. So I think that, those recommendations from that 2008 report are all valid today in terms of simplifying the operation of entities that are based in Canada that want to operate abroad. Second point I would make in terms of just simply compliance with Canada and interaction with the government in Canada, which is really, back to the reporting in terms of XBRL, these, standardized business reporting, which would be a mechanism which, entities could provide their information to the government, and that information could be used for many purposes by the government. It would be much more efficient, be much more effective. This is a recommendation I know that this committee has endorsed in the past, and we would encourage you to recommend it again. It has been implemented in other countries, for example, Australia, and with some good savings. So those are 2 thoughts that I would give back to you on your observations.
Mr. Baker, you have any comment on that?
Yeah, I
guess I'd start by saying the complexity is relative as well. That, like in Canada, it depends on which countries around the world we're comparing it to. If we compared Canada to the U.S., for example, I'd say Canada's in pretty good shape relative to complexity. So, and on some of the other suggestions you made about kind of standardizing some of these things that we have, like the financial reporting, financial accounting, and seeing some countries have just taken that and have used that in their tax regime. To me, it comes back to the tax policy. So that that's a simple regime, but there's a lot of nuances in accounting. Accounting isn't easy, and some instruments are treated differently for accounting purposes than their legal nature, and so that it'd be very difficult from my perspective in terms of in Canada, given that, to have a regime that was that simple without having some adjustment for it to reflect the policy objectives that we want to achieve. Cash accounting, for example, that you mentioned, that's perhaps a simpler regime, but would require, if indeed the financial reporting continues to be on an accrual basis, would require some adjustment. Plus, there'd be a cost to that, I think, because I think that's likely would be a deferral that for a lot of companies. And so then, from a policy perspective, I think there'd also be have to be a look at what the financial cost of that would be to the government in terms of revenue.
Thank you.
Many of the multinationals.
We're bumping up against time. Is there a brief question or comment?
The big question is that we need to go to an internationalized equivalent in compliance in order to simplify our international.
Okay.
Okay.
Brief response, or
that would achieve that.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Colleagues, thank you. I want to thank all of our witnesses of the second panel. It's been an excellent 3-hour panel here, and especially given what happened in this room and the other room ops in the hallway last week, it has been an especially wonderful time to have a very robust discussion here at the Finance Committee. I also do want to thank many of you, I think, for your member organizations contributing to the funds for the two soldiers' families. I really appreciate that. On behalf of all committee members, I want to thank you for that. So thank you all, colleagues. We'll see you tomorrow. Meeting adjourned.